Welcome to Caveman Sleep Stories. If you're here tonight, you're likely searching for rest, hoping to quiet the thoughts that won't settle and find your way gently toward sleep. We exist in a world of constant information, of medical answers available instantly, of pills for every ailment and solutions we take for granted. We have emergency rooms open all hours, pharmacies on every corner, antibiotics that cure infections in days. But there's something we've forgotten in all this pharmaceutical abundance, something our ancestors knew through necessity rather than choice. Tonight, we're exploring a question that might seem impossible at first. How did people survive without any of the medicine we consider essential? Not just survive occasionally or barely, but thrive well enough to populate the entire world, to raise families, to pass down knowledge across thousands of generations. How could anyone recover from infections without antibiotics? Why didn't everyone die from minor injuries that became infected? What did ancient people know about natural healing that allowed humanity to continue for millennia before modern medicine existed? We'll discover the sophisticated plant remedies that actually worked, the prevention practices that kept people healthier than we might expect, the robust immune systems built through constant challenge, the community care that supported healing, and the honest reality of what could be survived versus what remained fatal. We'll learn about willow bark and yarrow and honey, about bone setting and wound care, about the successes and the heartbreaking limitations. If you drift off while listening, that's exactly what should happen. Consider subscribing if these stories help you find rest. And there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description if you'd like to support this channel. A like helps others discover these sleep stories too. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's travel back to a time when people lived without hospitals or pharmacies, when survival depended on knowledge passed down through generations, when the body's own healing power and careful natural treatments were all anyone had. Yet somehow, against odds that seem impossible, people endured. The bark of willow trees, peeled carefully from young branches in early spring, when sap runs close to the surface, making the bark easier to separate from the wood beneath, chewed slowly to release the bitter compounds contained within the inner layers, or steeped in water warmed by fire-heated stones, dropped into bark containers until the liquid takes on amber color and intensely bitter taste. Contains salicylic acid, the same compound that forms the basis of modern aspirin. And people discover this not through chemistry or laboratory analysis, but through generations of careful observation and experience, noticing over decades and centuries that chewing willow bark eases the throbbing of headaches, reduces the burning intensity of fever, dulls the sharp edge of pain from injuries, and that this relief is real and repeatable and consistent enough to trust. Knowledge that once discovered gets passed down carefully from those who know to those who need to learn, from elder to younger, from healer to apprentice, becoming part of the essential knowledge that keeps people alive when pain or fever strikes and threatens to weaken someone beyond their ability to function or survive. The taste is bitter, intensely so, making the mouth pucker and tongue recoil, saliva flowing in response to the harsh flavor. But the bitterness becomes associated with relief, with the gradual easing that comes perhaps an hour after chewing, with the way fever heat begins to break into sweat that cools the skin, with the way sharp pain softens to dull ache that allows movement and thought and rest. And people learn to tolerate and even welcome the bitter taste because of what follows. Because the alternative of unrelieved pain or dangerous fever proves far worse than temporary unpleasant flavor. Not every tree provides the same strength of relief. Willows growing near water, their roots reaching down into moist soil and their branches hanging over streams and marshes, seem more potent than those on dry ground where growth comes harder and slower. Younger bark works better than old bark that has thickened and hardened and lost some of its active properties. And spring harvest yields stronger effects than autumn cutting when the tree has drawn its energy inward, preparing for winter dormancy. And this knowledge, too, accumulates through attention and comparison, through trying bark from different trees and different seasons, and remembering which brings the most consistent relief, which eases fever most reliably, which dulls pain most effectively. The willows themselves become marked in memory, their locations remembered, particularly good trees visited repeatedly for harvest. Strips of bark taken carefully to avoid killing the tree by removing too much at once, because a dead willow provides no future medicine, and a living tree that recovers from careful harvest can provide bark for many years. The harvesting technique matters, cutting shallow enough to take bark but not so deep as to damage the living wood beneath, taking strips from different sides of the tree in different years to allow each section time to heal before being harvested again, maintaining the resource through thoughtful use rather than depleting it through careless taking. The preparation varies depending on immediate need and available resources. Fresh bark chewed directly when someone suffers sudden pain or fever and requires immediate relief. The pieces small enough to chew thoroughly, kept in the mouth until the bitter taste fades, indicating that active compounds have been extracted into saliva and swallowed, then spat out and replaced with fresh pieces if stronger effect is needed. Dried bark stored for winter use or for carrying while traveling, the strips hung near the fire where warmth and smoke help preserve them, keeping their potency through months of storage, though with some loss of strength compared to fresh harvest. Tea made by steeping bark in hot water, the liquid easier to swallow than chewing the fibrous bark itself, particularly useful for children or people too weak to chew properly. The tea consumed slowly over the course of hours to maintain steady relief rather than the surge and fade that comes from chewing a large amount at once. The dosage knowledge develops through experience and sometimes through tragic error. Too little brings insufficient relief. Too much can cause stomach upset and ringing in the ears. The optimal amount varies by individual body size and tolerance, requires adjustment and observation and learning what works for each person. Yarrow, a plant with feathery leaves divided into countless tiny segments, giving the foliage a delicate lacy appearance, and white or pale pink flowers, clustered in flat-topped arrangements at the tops of sturdy stems that grow knee-high or taller in meadows and along paths where sunlight reaches the ground unobstructed by tree canopy, becomes one of the most valued healing plants because of what it does to bleeding wounds, and not through any mystical property, but through straightforward biological effects that people observe and learn to trust over countless applications to countless injuries across generations, spanning thousands of years. When yarrow leaves are crushed between stones or ground with a bit of water in a shallow depression worn into rock surface specifically for this purpose, creating a rough paste of green plant matter and liquid, and pressed directly onto a bleeding cut with firm, sustained pressure maintained for several minutes, the bleeding slows within moments and often stops entirely within a few minutes, even for wounds that initially seem quite severe with blood flowing freely and showing no sign of stopping on its own. And this happens because compounds in the plant cause blood vessels to constrict and blood to coagulate more quickly, effects that modern analysis has confirmed and measured in laboratory settings, but that ancient people understood simply through the evidence of their eyes. Apply yarrow and bleeding stops reliably, repeatedly, predictably across thousands of applications to thousands of wounds in hundreds of people over generations. Beyond stopping blood loss, which alone makes yarrow invaluable for treating injuries, the plant also appears to reduce the chance of infection, though people wouldn't have understood this in terms of bacteria or germs or microscopic organisms. but simply observed that wounds treated with yarrow seemed to heal cleaner and faster than wounds left untreated or treated with other substances. That the angry red inflammation that signals infection occurs less often when yarrow has been applied immediately and consistently throughout the healing process. That the foul-smelling discharge that indicates infection developing deep in tissue appears less frequently in yarrow-treated wounds compared to those treated differently or not treated at all. The mechanism likely involves both antimicrobial compounds that inhibit bacterial growth and anti-inflammatory properties that reduce the excessive immune response that can damage tissue while fighting infection. Though ancient practitioners need know nothing of these mechanisms to effectively employ the treatment, simply following the protocol that experience has proven works. Clean the wound thoroughly, apply yarrow paste, maintain pressure until bleeding stops, cover with protective material, check regularly for signs of problems, reapply yarrow daily until healing progresses to the point where infection risk has passed. For a people without surgical sutures to close gaping wounds, without antiseptic solutions to pour into cuts, without antibiotics to fight infections that establish themselves despite preventive measures, without blood transfusions to replace blood lost from injuries, having a plant that stops bleeding and reduces infection represents the difference between many injuries being survivable versus fatal, making yarrow knowledge quite literally life-saving, and ensuring that anyone who knows how to identify and prepare this plant carries that knowledge as carefully as they carry any tool or weapon, teaches that knowledge to others who will need it, preserves that information across generations as precious inheritance more valuable than any physical possession. The plant grows commonly enough that finding it rarely poses difficulty during the warmer months when it flourishes in its preferred habitats, and dried yarrow kept through winter retains enough potency to remain useful, though fresh proves more effective and is preferred whenever available, meaning that people gather and dry substantial quantities during late summer when the plant reaches peak potency, storing this medicine against future need. The identification of yarrow becomes critical knowledge passed carefully from those who know to those learning, because misidentifying plants can mean applying ineffective or even harmful substances to wounds when effective treatment is urgently needed, and several other plants bear superficial resemblance to yarrow in their feathery foliage or clustered flowers. The distinctive characteristics get taught through repeated observation and handling. The particular pattern of leaf division, the way stems feel when rolled between fingers, the smell when leaves are crushed, the specific appearance of flowers, the habitats where true yarrow grows versus where similar plants appear, the taste when a tiny piece of leaf is chewed, multiple confirming features learned together so that identification becomes certain rather than merely probable. Young people learning plant medicine accompany experienced gatherers repeatedly, watching and asking questions and being tested on their ability to correctly identify yarrow among other plants, not trusted to gather independently until they demonstrate consistent, accurate identification because the consequences of error prove too serious to risk. Pine resin, the sticky golden or amber substance that seeps from wounds in pine bark where branches have broken off or where injury has penetrated through the protective outer layers into the living tissue beneath, flowing slowly out and beginning to harden in air as volatile compounds evaporate, leaving behind the harder components, and people learn that this resin possesses remarkable properties for preventing infection in cuts and scrapes and burns, though again, without understanding the modern concept of antimicrobial action, or being able to see bacteria under microscopes, simply observing that wounds sealed with pine resin heal remarkably clean, that the resin seems to keep out whatever causes wounds to fester and fill with pus and spread angry red inflammation into surrounding tissue, that covering an injury with this natural substance provides protection that greatly improves healing outcomes compared to wounds left exposed or covered with materials that lack this protective quality. The resin must be collected carefully, scraped from tree wounds with a flat tool made of wood or bone or stone. The fresh liquid resin, sticky enough to adhere to everything it touches and difficult to remove from skin or tools, kept in a bark container or wrapped in leaves that prevent it from sticking to other objects, warmed slightly before application, so it spreads more easily across the wound surface without being so hot as to cause additional burn injury. And once applied, it forms a protective seal that adheres to skin and keeps dirt and contaminants away from damaged tissue, while the body works to repair itself underneath this natural bandage. Modern analysis reveals that pine resin contains compounds with genuine antiseptic properties, substances including various terpenes and acids that inhibit bacterial growth, that prevent microorganisms from establishing infections in protected wounds, providing antimicrobial effects comparable in some ways to modern topical antibiotics, though obviously without the targeted specificity or measured dosing of pharmaceutical preparations. Ancient people need only the practical observation that wounds treated this way heal better, faster, with less pain and swelling, with less chance of the dangerous spreading infection that can turn a minor cut into a life-threatening condition requiring drastic intervention, like cutting away infected tissue, or, in the worst cases, simply watching helplessly as someone dies from blood poisoning that originated in a wound that initially seemed manageable. The slightly sticky quality of the resin, even after partial hardening, means it adheres well to skin, staying in place through movement and activity, rather than falling off or being rubbed away by contact with clothing or other surfaces, though it must be replaced every few days as wounds progress through healing stages, each application requiring fresh resin collected from trees, warmed near fire, and spread carefully over the affected area. The collection of pine resin becomes regular activity, people checking known trees where resin accumulates, scraping off quantities whenever passing by good sources, maintaining supply of this valuable medicine against future need, because injuries happen without warning, and having treatment ready makes the difference between quick, effective response and dangerous delays while someone searches for materials. Some trees produce resin more prolifically than others, becoming known sources visited repeatedly, while trees damaged by fire or wind or animal activity often weep particularly heavy amounts of resin as they attempt to seal their wounds, providing abundant harvest opportunities. The storage of resin requires keeping it away from fire heat that might melt it into useless liquid, but in conditions dry enough to prevent mold from growing on or around it, usually wrapped in leaves and tucked into protected spots within the shelter, accessible when needed, but not in the way during normal activities. Chamomile flowers, small white petals arranged in a ring around raised yellow centers, growing low to the ground in patches where the soil has been disturbed by digging or by animal activity. Blooming through the warmer months in numbers that make gathering easy, steeped in hot water, create a tea that settles upset stomachs, eases cramping in the belly, helps with the kind of digestive distress that leaves a person weak and unable to eat properly. And while the effects are gentler than some other remedies, less dramatic than the bleeding stopping power of yarrow or the fever-breaking properties of willow, the consistency of relief makes chamomile valuable for treating minor complaints that might otherwise persist for days and drain a person's strength through constant discomfort and inability to maintain adequate nutrition. The tea tastes mild, slightly sweet with hints of apple-like flavor, nothing like the harsh bitterness of willow or the earthiness of other medicinal plants, and perhaps this palatability contributes to its use, making it easier to get sick people to drink enough of the preparation to achieve beneficial effects without the reluctance that bitter remedies inspire. For young children especially, who might refuse bitter remedies or fight against taking medicine that tastes unpleasant, chamomile provides a treatment they will actually consume without struggle. And the gentle nature of its effects means little risk of doing harm, even if given in larger amounts than strictly necessary, providing safety margin that makes it appropriate for treating children whose smaller bodies might be more susceptible to overdose effects of more potent remedies. Pregnant women drink chamomile tea when morning sickness makes eating difficult, finding that the warm liquid stays down more easily than food and provides some relief from constant nausea that can make the early months of pregnancy miserable, though severe cases still leave women thin and weakened, unable to nourish themselves or the growing child adequately, occasionally resulting in loss of pregnancy or in babies born small and weak. Elders with failing digestion, whose bodies no longer produce the quantities of digestive fluids needed to break down heavier foods efficiently, who experience discomfort and bloating after eating meals that once caused no problems, drink chamomile regularly to ease the discomfort that comes with eating, allowing them to maintain nutrition through their final years with less pain and difficulty, extending their lives by ensuring they continue consuming adequate food rather than avoiding eating because the discomfort it causes seems worse than the hunger it relieves. The knowledge of these plants and hundreds more like them represents not random discovery, but accumulated wisdom refined over millennia, with each generation testing and observing and passing down what works, what doesn't work, what helps some conditions but not others, what dosages produce beneficial effects versus harmful ones, what time of year to harvest for maximum potency, how to prepare each plant for best results, how to store medicines to preserve their effectiveness through seasons when fresh plants aren't available, how to recognize when a stored plant has lost its potency and must be replaced with fresh supply before it becomes useless or potentially harmful. An elder who knows 50 useful plants carries knowledge that took perhaps thousands of years to accumulate. Information purchased through countless trials and errors and careful attention to outcomes, through comparing this plant to that one for treating similar conditions, this preparation method to that method for extracting or concentrating active compounds, through remembering what worked when someone recovered and what failed when someone died despite treatment, building a database of practical medicine encoded in human memory rather than written texts. This knowledge exists not in written form, no books or scrolls or tablets recording which plants treat which conditions, but in memory, in demonstration, in the careful teaching that happens when an older person takes a younger one out to gather plants and explains not just which ones to collect, but why these particular plants, when during the year they show maximum effectiveness, how much to gather and prepare for a given condition, for what purposes each plant proves useful, with what expectations of success in treating various ailments. The teaching involves showing the plant in its natural habitat, describing its distinguishing characteristics in detail, having the student smell and touch and sometimes taste it to establish multiple sensory memories that aid identification, explaining what the plant does when used medicinally, demonstrating preparation methods through actual practice rather than merely describing them, supervising early attempts at independent preparation to ensure the student understands the process correctly, gradually building competence through repeated practice and observation. The loss of a knowledgeable elder means the loss of information that cannot be recovered except through rediscovering it over generations of new trial and error, remedies that might work but are now forgotten, because the person who knew about them died before passing that knowledge to someone who survives, treatments that could save lives but remain unknown to the generation that continues, reducing the medical knowledge available to the group and potentially meaning that people die from conditions that might have been treatable if only someone still knew the right plant or preparation or application method. This creates strong incentive to ensure medical knowledge gets transmitted to multiple people rather than residing in just one or two individuals whose deaths could eliminate critical information, encouraging anyone interested in healing to learn from those who know, creating some redundancy in knowledge storage so that the loss of one person doesn't erase entire categories of treatment knowledge. Someone cuts their hand on a sharp stone edge while butchering meat from a fresh kill, the blade slipping when meat proves tougher than expected, slicing across the palm from thumb to pinky in a gash, perhaps the length of 2 finger widths, and blood flows freely from the cut, not pumping in spurts that would indicate a severed artery requiring immediate desperate pressure, but flowing steadily enough that something must be done to stop it before too much blood is lost and weakness follows, before the hand loses so much blood that the person becomes dizzy and unable to continue working or thinking clearly. Immediately, before anything else, before even applying pressure to slow the bleeding, the wound gets rinsed with clean water from a trusted source, a spring if possible, bubbling directly from the ground and thus presumably clean, a stream that runs clear and cold over stones if no spring is near, water that looks clear and tastes good and comes from a source upstream of any contamination, never water from a stagnant pool or from downstream of camp where waste enters the water. And this rinsing isn't merely about removing visible dirt, but about flushing out anything that might have contaminated the wound, bits of meat or hide from the butchering, stone dust from the blade, any substance that might carry whatever causes wounds to fester and become infected. The rinsing continues longer than seems necessary, water poured repeatedly over the cut until only blood flows from it, with no other material visible in the wound or washing away in the rinse water. The person helping with this cleaning, pouring water steadily while examining the wound to ensure it's truly clean, not just superficially rinsed, but thoroughly flushed of any possible contamination. This simple act of thorough cleaning, taking perhaps 5 minutes of careful rinsing before moving on to the next step of treatment, makes an enormous difference in whether the wound heals clean or becomes infected, reducing the bacterial load introduced by the injury, removing foreign material that might provide sites for bacteria to establish themselves, creating cleaner conditions for healing. Once cleaned, yarrow leaves crushed into paste get pressed firmly against the cut. The green pulp spread across the entire length of the wound, covered with more crushed leaves to create a thick layer of plant material in direct contact with damaged tissue, and pressure maintained firmly with palm pressed against the poultice for several minutes until bleeding slows and then stops completely as the yarrow's compounds take effect and blood vessels constrict, and blood begins to coagulate more rapidly than it would without this plant assistance. The yarrow stays in place, held by a strip of soft leather or sinew or plant fiber cordage wrapped around the hand snugly enough to keep the poultice in contact with the wound, but not so tight as to cut off circulation to the fingers, which would cause them to become pale and cold and tingly, eventually leading to tissue damage if circulation remains restricted too long. The wrapping technique requires some skill, tight enough to be effective but not so tight as to cause harm, starting at the wrist for stability and spiraling around the hand to cover the wounded area, tucked and tied securely so it won't come loose during normal movement. Over the next hours, someone checks the wound periodically to ensure bleeding has truly stopped, not just slowed to oozing that might restart into more serious flow, that the yarrow remains in place and hasn't been displaced by movement or by swelling as injured tissue responds to damage, that the hand isn't swelling excessively or showing dark discoloration that might indicate blood flow is restricted too much by the wrapping, or that something concerning is developing within the wound that requires closer examination and possibly different treatment. The next day, when the person wakes from a night's sleep, during which the hand throbbed with dull ache that made sleeping difficult, despite exhaustion, the yarrow poultice is carefully removed. Dried brown plant material stuck to skin with dried blood, gently peeled away or moistened slightly to soften it and make removal easier without reopening the wound. The wound gets examined carefully for signs of infection. Excessive redness spreading beyond the cut edges and into surrounding skin, heat radiating from the area that feels distinctly warmer than uninjured parts of the hand, swelling that seems worse rather than better after a day of healing, any discharge of pus or foul-smelling fluid that would indicate bacteria are multiplying within the wound despite preventive efforts. And if the wound appears to be healing cleanly, edges perhaps beginning to knit together, swelling minimal, no signs of developing infection, it gets rinsed again with clean water to remove dried blood and old plant material, cleaned gently but thoroughly, and a fresh application of treatment applied, this time perhaps honey spread thickly over the cut surface and covered with a clean piece of soft hide that protects the wound from dirt and contamination while allowing some air circulation that seems to help healing. Honey possesses remarkable properties for preventing infection, properties that ancient people recognized through observation long before modern science confirmed that honey contains hydrogen peroxide produced by enzymatic action, that its high sugar content creates osmotic environment where bacteria cannot thrive because water gets drawn from their cells, that its slightly acidic pH inhibits bacterial growth, that it actually promotes healing through multiple biochemical mechanisms, including stimulating immune responses and providing building blocks for new tissue formation. The honey used for wound treatment is raw and unprocessed, taken directly from wild beehives found in hollow trees or rock crevices, containing not just pure honey but also bits of wax and propolis and sometimes bee parts, all of which may contribute additional beneficial properties, with the wax helping to seal the wound and the propolis bringing its own antimicrobial compounds to the treatment. The application requires spreading honey thickly enough to completely cover the wound surface, creating a barrier layer that coats all exposed tissue, then covering this with a piece of hide or bark or large leaf that keeps dirt out while holding the honey in place, wrapped and secured similarly to how the yarrow poultice was held. The honey stays in place for a full day before being removed, the sticky substance still largely present, though some has absorbed into the wound or been displaced by movement, and the wound underneath typically shows good healing progress, edges drawing together, new tissue beginning to form, less redness and swelling than would typically appear at this stage in wounds not receiving such treatment. The honey gets rinsed away, the area cleaned again, though more gently now that healing is underway, and rough handling might disrupt new tissue formation, examined again for any signs of problems, and either reapplied if the wound still needs protection and infection prevention, or left open to air if healing has progressed to the point where exposure causes no harm and might even speed the final stages of healing. Through this cycle of cleaning, treatment, observation, retreatment, adjusting approach based on how the wound responds, most cuts and scrapes and minor injuries heal completely within a span of days to weeks. The body's natural healing processes, supported by treatments that reduce infection risk and keep the wound environment conducive to tissue repair rather than hindering healing through contamination or inappropriate handling. The success rate for minor to moderate wounds proves surprisingly high when this protocol is followed carefully, somewhere likely above 90% for cuts that don't penetrate deeply into underlying structures like tendons or muscles. that don't introduce massive contamination from heavily soiled blades or from wounds sustained in particularly dirty conditions, that receive prompt and proper attention rather than being ignored or treated carelessly. Simple cuts, even fairly deep ones that bleed significantly initially, close and heal as long as blood flow can be controlled and infection prevented. And the combination of thorough cleaning, natural antiseptics like honey and pine resin, protective covering that keeps contaminants away from healing tissue, and the body's own repair mechanisms provides exactly what such wounds need to heal successfully. Even injuries that initially appear quite severe, gashes from sharp tools or animal attacks, puncture wounds from thorns or wooden implements, tears in skin from falls or collisions with rocks, these often heal completely if treated immediately and carefully and monitored throughout the healing process, leaving only scars as evidence that injury occurred, scars that fade somewhat over months and years until they become merely pale lines on skin that otherwise appears normal. The body possesses remarkable capacity to repair damaged tissue when given the support it needs, when contamination is minimized and healing environment maintained, when the person remains otherwise healthy and nourished enough to direct energy toward repair processes, when infection is prevented from establishing itself and causing inflammation and tissue destruction that overwhelms healing capacity. The immune system, constantly active in identifying and eliminating bacteria and other pathogens, works most effectively when bacterial numbers remain low, when infection doesn't gain foothold before defenses can respond, and the cleaning and antiseptic treatments provide exactly this advantage, keeping bacterial populations minimal during the critical first days when infection either establishes itself and becomes a serious problem, or fails to take hold, and the wound proceeds to clean healing. However, the limitations of these treatments become apparent with certain types of wounds, deep punctures that drive contamination far into tissue where cleaning cannot reach, where the narrow, deep wound channel provides poor access for rinsing and poor drainage for any infection that develops, wounds that expose bone or penetrate into body cavities where cleaning becomes impossible and contamination inevitable, injuries that damage major blood vessels in ways that cannot be controlled by pressure and plant poultices, where blood loss continues despite best efforts until the person becomes dangerously weak, wounds that occur in areas impossible to keep clean or protected, like the bottom of feet, in people who must continue walking, or hands of people who must continue using them for work, because survival demands constant activity. These wounds show much higher rates of infection despite best efforts, the characteristic signs appearing within days, spreading redness that advances visibly from hour to hour, increasing pain that builds from dull ache to sharp throbbing agony, fever developing as the body responds to spreading infection, swelling that extends well beyond the immediate wound area, discharge that begins clear but becomes cloudy and then frankly purulent, smell that changes from normal healing wound to foul odor, characteristic of bacteria multiplying in dead tissue. Once infection takes hold deeply in tissue, once it spreads into blood and carries throughout the body, causing the systemic response called sepsis, the arsenal of plant remedies and natural treatments often proves inadequate to stop the progression, the infection overwhelming the body's defenses faster than immune system can mount effective response, bacteria producing toxins that poison blood and organs, fever climbing despite willow bark and cooling treatments, the person declining visibly from hour to hour as strength drains away and consciousness begins to waver. Some people survive even serious infections, their bodies mounting immune responses strong enough to overcome the bacterial invasion, fighting off what threatens to kill them through sheer biological resilience, through immune systems that happen to be particularly robust. through infections that happen to be caused by less aggressive bacterial strains, through luck of timing and circumstance that allows healing to prevail over destruction. But others decline despite all treatments attempted, despite constant nursing and best available medicines, despite prayers or rituals or desperate efforts to find better remedies, fever climbing higher until it exceeds what the body can tolerate, infection spreading until organ failure begins, strength fading until the person can no longer wake fully, until finally death comes, perhaps a week after injury from what begins as a wound that seems survivable. The deaths from infected wounds represent sobering reality of limitations, reminder that natural medicine has boundaries beyond which it cannot help, conditions that require interventions that simply don't exist in the Paleolithic world, treatments like antibiotics that directly kill bacteria rather than merely supporting the body's own defenses, like surgical debridement of dead infected tissue, like intravenous fluids to support organ function during severe sepsis, none of which are available, and thus severe wound infections carry significant mortality rates despite best care. The survivors of serious wound infections, those whose bodies successfully fight off the bacterial invasion, often endure weeks of illness and weakness, losing significant body weight, requiring constant care and prime food resources, slowly regaining strength after the fever breaks and infection clears, gradually returning to normal function, though sometimes with lasting effects like chronic pain or reduced mobility in the affected area or persistent weakness that never fully resolves. A child falls from a tree while reaching for bird eggs, a nest spotted high in branches where parent birds have been flying, the climb seeming manageable and the promise of eggs worth the effort. But a branch breaks under small weight and the child plummets, landing hard on rocky ground below, hitting with impact that drives breath from lungs and brings immediate cry of pain once breath returns. The immediate cry brings adults running from nearby activities, dropping tools or meat or hides they were working with, covering ground quickly to find the child conscious and breathing but unable to stand, left leg bent at an unnatural angle midway down the shin where there should be straight bone, clearly broken, though skin remains intact with no bone penetrating through, no blood visible though the area already begins to swell. This represents a survivable injury, painful and serious but not inherently fatal, the kind of broken bone that people have experienced many times before, that they know how to treat with reasonable hope of success, and treatment begins immediately with careful handling to avoid causing further damage, to keep the broken bone ends from shifting and potentially piercing through skin, which would transform a manageable fracture into a likely fatal one. Several people work together, experienced hands assessing the injury through touch and observation, feeling along the leg to determine exactly where the break occurred and whether it feels like a clean break or a more complicated fracture with multiple fragments, one supporting the child's body and upper leg to prevent movement during the next steps, another carefully straightening the bent leg while the child screams in pain that cannot be avoided because the leg must be realigned for proper healing to occur. The straightening happens slowly but firmly, gentle pull applied to the foot while hands guide the leg back toward normal position, pulling until the leg assumes something closer to its natural shape. Resistance felt as misaligned bone ends catch and then overcome the resistance. The person doing the pulling, relying on experience and feel to know when alignment is achieved as well as possible, given that bone ends cannot be seen directly. Once straightened, the leg must be immobilized completely to prevent any movement at all of the broken bone during the weeks of healing required for bone to knit back together, and this requires sturdy splints, straight branches or pieces of bark cut to appropriate length, thick enough to prevent bending under the weight of the leg or during any inadvertent movement, Surfaces smoothed to avoid creating pressure points that might damage skin during the long period they'll remain in place. The splints get positioned along both sides of the broken leg, sometimes 3 or 4 splints placed around the circumference for better immobilization, extending well above and below the fracture site to prevent any movement at the break location by restricting motion of both the knee and ankle, preventing the joints from bending, and thus preventing the broken bone in between from shifting. These get wrapped firmly in place with leather strips or plant fiber cordage or strips of hide, the wrapping starting at one end and spiraling along the length of the splints, pulled tight enough to hold everything securely but monitored carefully to ensure circulation isn't cut off to the foot, which would appear pale and cold and indicate the wrapping needs to be loosened slightly. Padding of soft hides or moss goes between splints and skin where bones lie close to surface, preventing the hard splints from pressing directly on skin and creating sores during the long healing period. The entire process takes perhaps an hour of careful work, multiple people contributing their experience and hands, the child eventually quieting as the leg becomes immobilized and the sharp pain of movement gives way to the dull, throbbing ache of injured tissue. The child lies still for days, kept flat and quiet in a comfortable sleeping area, leg propped on folded hides to elevate it slightly, which seems to reduce swelling, given water frequently to maintain hydration, and soft foods easy to eat while reclining since sitting up to eat normally would require moving the leg more than advisable. Adults take turns staying with the child, keeping watch to ensure the child remains still, rather than trying to move, despite the pain such movement would cause, distracting from pain through stories and attention when the throbbing becomes overwhelming and the child begins to cry from discomfort that seems endless. Willow bark tea helps dull the pain to more tolerable levels, given several times a day in amounts judged appropriate for the child's smaller body. Though never eliminates pain entirely, the bone injury too severe for any available remedy to completely relieve, and the child learns to remain still because movement sends sharp jolts through the leg that teach the lesson more effectively than any words or scoldings could, pain itself becoming the enforcer of the necessary immobilization. Over days and then weeks, the initial severe pain gradually subsides to constant ache, still present but less overwhelming, allowing the child to pay attention to other things, to eat better, to sleep more easily, though waking frequently when shifting position inadvertently moves the leg. The splints remain in place for what the group estimates is long enough for bone to heal. Judgment based on experience with previous fractures, usually something like a full cycle of moon for a child's simple fracture, longer for adults or more complicated breaks. Eventually, carefully, the wrappings are removed and splints taken away, the leg examined to see if healing has occurred, gentle pressure applied to test whether bone has fused sufficiently to bear weight, the leg itself often appearing smaller than the other from weeks of immobilization that has caused muscle to waste away from lack of use. The child begins to put slight weight on the leg while still using a stick for support, testing whether the bone has knitted strongly enough to bear load without causing pain or feeling like it might give way, gradually increasing weight bearing over days as confidence grows and pain remains minimal. Some fractures heal perfectly, bone fusing back together so completely that full strength returns and no trace of injury remains, except perhaps a slight thickening where the break occurred, a bump that can be felt under skin where extra bone formed during healing, but which causes no functional limitation. The child returns to normal activities, climbing and running and playing as before, the broken leg as strong as the uninjured one, the injury becoming merely memory and story rather than permanent limitation. Other fractures heal with some deformity. a slight bend or twist that becomes apparent when the two legs are compared side by side, a leg that ends up slightly shorter than the other, causing a limp that persists for life, a persistent ache that worsens in cold weather or when rain approaches, the person learning to predict weather by the pain in old injuries. But the person walks and functions and survives, contributes to the group despite the limitation, the injury becoming merely something to work around rather than a death sentence. Adaptation and accommodation, allowing productive life to continue despite imperfect healing. The critical factor determining outcome in broken bones is whether skin remains intact or whether bone pierces through, because compound fractures, where broken bone punctures skin and creates an open wound communicating between the external environment and the fracture site deep in tissue, almost always result in infection that proves fatal despite all treatment attempts. The combination of deep tissue damage, bone fragments that cannot be thoroughly cleaned, bacteria introduced directly into areas of poor blood supply where the body's immune defenses struggle to reach effectively, creating conditions that overwhelm available treatments. When bone pierces skin, the immediate priority becomes pushing it back inside if possible, cleaning the wound as thoroughly as can be managed given the complicated geometry of bone protruding through skin, applying every antiseptic treatment known, honey, pine resin, yarrow, whatever might help prevent the infection that probably comes anyway, wrapping and splinting as carefully as with any other break, but the outcome remains grim, infection developing within days as bacteria multiply in the damaged tissue around the fracture site. The wound may be cleaned as thoroughly as possible, honey applied liberally, yarrow used to stop any bleeding, pine resin spread over the area once bleeding is controlled. But infection develops anyway, creeping up the limb and spreading redness and swelling, causing fever and delirium as bacteria enter the bloodstream and spread throughout the body, and usually the person dies within a week or two. Or if they survive longer, it's often because the limb is so badly damaged that it loses circulation and withers, essentially dying while still attached to the living body, turning dark and cold and eventually mummifying until finally the person succumbs to systemic infection or to the constant drain on resources that attempting to heal such severe damage creates. This reality means that certain falls, certain injuries, certain accidents that break bones badly carry death with them almost inevitably, and the difference between a survivable injury and a fatal one may be merely whether the sharp broken end of bone happens to pierce skin or stops just short of doing so, a matter of perhaps a fraction of an inch, determining whether someone lives or dies, whether a child grows to adulthood or becomes another small grave marked with stones. This harsh truth means that everyone approaches activities with awareness of the risks, knowing that certain falls or blows could result not just in temporary injury, but in death that follows inevitably from the nature of the damage sustained, encouraging caution without preventing the necessary risks that hunting and gathering and simply living in the natural world require. Parents warn children about climbing too high, about the danger not just of falling, but of falling badly, about how the manner of landing determines whether injury can be survived, teaching through stories of past accidents that ended well and those that ended in death, building appropriate fear that promotes safety without creating paralysis that would prevent normal childhood exploration and learning. Simple fractures, however, heal at impressive rates. Probably 70 to 80% of clean breaks mend well enough for the person to regain function, a success rate that reflects both the body's robust healing capacity when properly supported and the effectiveness of straightforward splinting techniques that people develop through long experience with broken bones across many individuals and many injuries over generations. Arms heal more easily than legs because they need not bear full body weight during recovery, allowing more complete immobilization during the critical healing period. The injured person able to remain active and mobile while keeping the broken arm still, maintaining overall health and strength while the arm heals. Ribs heal on their own simply through binding the chest to restrict movement and reduce the pain that deep breathing causes when rib ends grate against each other during the healing process, though the binding must be tight enough to limit movement, but not so tight as to prevent breathing adequately, a balance that requires careful judgment and adjustment. Collarbones knit back together with the arm held in a sling for several weeks, the position taking weight and pull off the broken collarbone and allowing the bone ends to remain in contact during healing, though collarbone fractures often heal with visible bump where the break occurred and sometimes with slight deformity that causes the shoulder to sit differently than before injury. Finger and toe bones reset themselves adequately even with minimal intervention, as long as the digit is taped or tied to an adjacent one for stability during healing, the neighboring bone acting as natural splint, though finger fractures sometimes heal with stiffness that persists even after bone has fully fused, reducing dexterity in that hand, particularly troublesome if the injury is to the dominant hand of someone who performs skilled work requiring fine finger control. Children's bones heal faster and more completely than adult bones, often achieving perfect realignment, even when initial positioning wasn't ideal. The younger body's more active healing processes and greater remodeling capacity, meaning that children can recover from fractures that would leave adults with permanent deformity. Though severe fractures can still result in problems even in children, and growth plate injuries sometimes lead to one limb ending up shorter than the other as the child grows and the damaged growth plate produces less bone than the normal one on the opposite side. Elders' bones heal more slowly and sometimes fail to fuse completely, leaving them weakened and prone to re-breaking with minor stress. The slower metabolism and reduced healing capacity of aging bodies, meaning that broken bones in older individuals carry worse prognosis, sometimes failing to heal at all and leaving the person permanently disabled, unable to walk if the break is in leg, or unable to use the arm if the break is there, becoming dependent on others for care and assistance with basic activities. The knowledge of when fractures will heal well versus when they likely won't, when aggressive splinting and prolonged immobilization offers good chance of success, versus when even best efforts probably fail, develops through experience with many broken bones in many people, learning to recognize the signs that predict outcomes, how the break feels when being set, whether bone ends can be brought into good alignment or remain separated by muscle contraction, pulling them apart, how much swelling develops in the first days, which may indicate severity of soft tissue damage, whether pain gradually improves or remains intense, suggesting healing isn't progressing normally. This prognostic skill helps people make realistic assessments about whether someone will likely recover, will likely be left with limitations, or might die from complications. Setting appropriate expectations and allowing the group to plan for how to accommodate an injured member through recovery or through permanent disability or through death that seems increasingly inevitable. Fever brings its own terror, the burning heat radiating from skin that feels too hot to touch comfortably, the shivers that alternate with sweating as the body attempts to regulate temperature that has climbed above normal, the confusion and restlessness that accompany high temperatures as the brain functions less effectively in the overheated environment, the very real danger that the body will overheat beyond what brain and organs can tolerate, causing permanent damage or death even if the underlying infection eventually clears. Fever treatment begins with simple cooling, moving the person to shade or the coolest part of the shelter away from the fire, removing insulating furs and hides that trap heat, stripping the person down to minimal clothing or complete nakedness if necessary to allow heat to radiate away from the body, placing cloths soaked in cold water across forehead and chest and belly where major blood vessels run close to surface and can be cooled effectively, changing these cloths frequently as they warm from contact with hot skin, maintaining cooling efforts continuously as long as fever remains dangerously high. Sometimes, if the fever climbs dangerously high, reaching levels where the person becomes barely conscious or begins having seizures from the overheated brain, the person might even be submerged briefly in a cold stream or have cold water poured over their body repeatedly, though this carries its own risks of shocking the body too severely and causing the heart to stop or breathing to cease from the sudden extreme temperature change, requiring careful judgment about whether the fever danger exceeds the cooling danger. The watchers monitor constantly, checking skin temperature frequently by touch, observing level of consciousness and degree of confusion, watching for seizures that might indicate brain damage occurring from excessive heat, making continuous decisions about whether cooling efforts need to be intensified or whether they can be reduced slightly as fever begins to break. Alongside physical cooling comes willow bark tea, given as frequently as the person can swallow, someone supporting the head and holding a cup to lips, encouraging sips even when the fevered person resists or seems too confused to understand what's being asked, because the compounds in willow truly do reduce fever through the same mechanism that modern aspirin uses, blocking the biochemical signals that cause the body to raise its temperature set point, allowing the fever to break more quickly and stay lower than it would without treatment. The tea is prepared strong, using more bark than for pain relief, steeped longer to extract maximum active compounds, cooled enough that it won't burn the mouth, but given while still warm because cold liquids might cause shivering, that would actually raise body temperature despite being cold, the paradox of cooling methods requiring careful attention to how the body responds. Yarrow tea also seems to help with fever, perhaps through slightly different mechanisms than willow, possibly working through promoting sweating, which helps cool the body as moisture evaporates from skin, or through other properties that affect the body's temperature regulation. And combining the two remedies often works better than either alone, people having observed over generations that certain plant combinations show synergistic effects beyond what each provides individually, though without understanding the biochemistry behind such synergy, simply knowing through repeated trials that yarrow plus willow works better than either alone for fever treatment. The teas are alternated or mixed together, given continuously throughout the fever, someone constantly preparing fresh batches and bringing them to the sick person, maintaining steady supply because running out of fever medicine during a crisis might allow temperature to climb again after having been partially controlled. Some fevers break within a day or two, the person's temperature gradually normalizing over the course of hours, first dropping from dangerously high to merely elevated, then down to slight fever, finally returning to normal warmth that feels cool by comparison to the burning heat of full fever, sweating, signaling that the crisis has passed as the body releases excess heat through evaporation of moisture on skin and hunger and thirst returning as signs of recovery, the person asking for food and water where previously they refused everything or were too confused to understand offers of sustenance. These cases probably represent infections that the body's immune system successfully contained and defeated, bacterial or viral invaders that failed to gain sufficient foothold to cause lasting damage or death despite making the person seriously ill for days, the fever serving its purpose, raising body temperature to levels that inhibit pathogen reproduction, enhancing immune system activity by speeding up biochemical reactions involved in fighting infection, and then subsiding once the threat was eliminated or reduced to levels that the immune system could control without needing the fever response anymore. The person who survives a fever emerges weakened and needing several days of rest and good food to regain full strength, having lost body weight from days of not eating adequately, dehydrated from sweating and from the increased water loss that accompanies fever, muscles weakened from inactivity during illness, but fundamentally intact and healthy, expected to make full recovery and return to normal activities within perhaps a week or two. Young adults in good health show the best outcomes with fever illnesses, their robust immune systems often mounting effective responses before infection spreads too far. Their strong constitutions allowing them to tolerate the stress of high fever and the period of weakness that follows, their bodies bouncing back quickly once the illness resolves. Children show good recovery rates when they survive the initial crisis, though they're more vulnerable during the acute illness phase when high fever poses greater danger to their smaller bodies and developing brains. But those who make it through the worst typically recover fully. Very young children and older adults show higher mortality rates from fevers. The very young because their immune systems are not yet fully developed and less capable of mounting the vigorous response needed to overcome serious infections. The elderly because their aging immune systems function less effectively and their bodies tolerate stress less well, the reserves of strength needed to survive serious illness diminished by the accumulated effects of decades of living. An infant with high fever requires constant cooling and desperate attempts to get fluids into the small body, but sometimes dies within a day or two despite all efforts, the infection overwhelming the immature immune system before it can mount effective defense. An elder with fever might linger longer but still decline steadily, the body fighting but losing ground day by day until death comes quietly after a week or more of illness, the group gathering to witness the passing and grieve the loss of knowledge and experience that dies with the person. But other fevers continue climbing despite all treatments, the person's temperature reaching levels where confusion gives way to unconsciousness, where the body becomes almost too hot to touch, where seizures may occur from the overheated brain, muscles contracting violently and uncontrollably as electrical activity in the brain goes haywire from the excessive heat, breathing becoming rapid and shallow or irregular, and gasping as the brain stem that controls breathing functions poorly in the extreme conditions. These cases usually end in death, the underlying infection having spread beyond what the immune system can control, bacteria multiplying in blood or organs faster than the body's defenses can eliminate them. Toxins produced by bacteria poisoning the body and overwhelming organ systems, causing them to fail one by one. Kidneys stopping their work of filtering blood, liver failing to process toxins, heart struggling to pump effectively, lungs filling with fluid that drowns the person from inside. The watchers can do little except continue cooling treatments, continue offering willow bark tea when the person rouses enough to swallow without choking, keep them clean and comfortable in their final days. Stay with them through the crisis so they don't die alone, but the outcome increasingly appears predetermined as hours pass without improvement, as fever remains high despite every effort to bring it down, as the person becomes less and less responsive until they no longer wake at all. Often death comes within a few days of fever's onset, the person slipping from restless sleep into coma and then simply stopping breathing, the heart eventually ceasing to beat, the skin rapidly cooling as the body's temperature regulation shuts down and the corpse begins taking on the temperature of the surrounding air. These deaths, from what modern medicine would classify as bacterial infections, treatable with antibiotics, pneumonia filling the lungs with fluid and bacteria, sepsis spreading infection throughout the bloodstream, meningitis inflaming the membranes surrounding the brain and spinal cord, severe strep or staph infections destroying tissue faster than the body can heal or contain them, probably account for significant mortality in Paleolithic populations, perhaps 10 to 20% of all deaths in adults, a toll that represents the starkest limitation of natural medicine, the clearest demonstration that plant remedies and careful nursing, while helpful for many conditions, cannot match the life-saving power of antimicrobial drugs that directly kill bacteria rather than merely supporting the body's own defenses. The honest assessment requires acknowledging both capabilities and limitations simultaneously. Fever treatments available through plant medicines genuinely help, reducing suffering even when they cannot save life, making the person more comfortable during their illness, whether they survive or die, probably improving survival rates by 10 or 20% compared to no treatment at all, breaking some fevers that might otherwise prove fatal, keeping temperatures lower, and buying time for immune systems to mount effective responses before organ damage becomes irreversible. Yet, even with best treatment, mortality from serious fever illnesses remains high, perhaps 30 to 50% for severe cases, depending on the specific infection and the individual's health status before becoming ill, meaning that half or more of people who develop life-threatening infections survive them through the combination of natural remedies and robust immune function, while the remainder die despite identical care and attention, their particular infections proving too aggressive or their individual immune responses inadequate to overcome the challenge, the factors determining who lives and who dies remaining mysterious and beyond anyone's control. Clean water flows from sources that people learn to trust, springs bubbling directly from the ground, the water emerging cold and clear from deep underground where it has been filtered through layers of soil and rock, streams running fast and clear over stones where constant movement and exposure to sunlight help keep water clean, water collected from rain before it touches earth by placing containers during storms to catch falling water that hasn't yet had opportunity to contact soil or surfaces that might contaminate it. And contaminated water gets avoided based on observable characteristics like cloudiness indicating suspended particles, bad smell suggesting decomposition or contamination, bitter or strange taste that indicates something wrong with the water, or the presence of dead animals or waste upstream of the collection point that would introduce harmful materials into the water. This knowledge develops not from understanding germ theory or knowing about bacteria and parasites that water can carry, but simply from observing that certain water sources correlate with illness while others don't, that people who drink from the spring stay healthier than those who drink from the stagnant pool where water sits unmoving and warm, that avoiding water downstream of camps reduces the frequency of the awful gut illnesses that leave people weak and dehydrated, that water from some sources makes people sick while water from other sources seems safe. The observations accumulate over generations, building knowledge about which specific sources are reliable in which seasons, which streams or springs provide safe water year-round, versus which become questionable during dry periods when flow diminishes, which standing water should never be consumed no matter how thirsty someone becomes, versus which pools are acceptable in emergencies. Children learn early to recognize good water sources and avoid bad ones, taught to look for particular characteristics and to prefer certain types of sources. The lessons reinforced through stories of people who became sick from drinking bad water and the suffering such illness brought, creating cautious approach to water selection that probably prevents many illnesses, even though the mechanism by which bad water causes illness remains unknown. Waste disposal happens far from water sources and living areas. specific locations designated for this purpose, usually downstream of the camp if near a watercourse, so that any contamination flows away from, rather than toward the group, or downwind, so that smells carry away, rather than toward sleeping and working areas. Distance maintained carefully, because experience teaches that camps where waste accumulates near living spaces see more illness than camps that maintain separation between living areas and waste areas. The practice develops not from understanding how disease transmits through fecal contamination, but from noticing patterns. Groups that are careless about waste disposal get sick more often, particularly with digestive illnesses, while groups that maintain strict separation stay healthier, making the connection between waste proximity and illness even without understanding the mechanism. This represents sophisticated public health practice arrived at through observation and consequence, rather than through any understanding of how disease actually transmits. But the effects are real and measurable. Groups that follow these practices show lower rates of diarrheal illnesses, fever, and other contagious conditions compared to groups that are less fastidious about water and waste management, the difference perhaps reducing disease incidence by 30 to 50% compared to careless practices, a substantial improvement in health outcomes achieved simply through behavioral rules that can be taught and followed without requiring any medical knowledge or understanding of disease causation. The rules become part of cultural practice, taught to children as normal, proper behavior rather than as medical intervention, followed automatically without needing to think about reasons, becoming so ingrained that violation seems wrong and disgusting rather than merely inadvisable. When someone develops a cough and fever, particularly if accompanied by the kind of exhaustion that suggests contagious illness rather than simple injury or localized infection, the person often moves to separate sleeping space, farther from others, toward the edge of the shelter or even outside, under separate covering if weather permits, reducing close contact that might spread whatever they carry to others who remain healthy. The sick person uses their own bowl, their own water container, their own sleeping hides that won't be shared with others until the illness has fully passed and items have been thoroughly cleaned or aired out for long enough that they no longer pose risk of transmission. The specific duration based on experience with how long items need to be isolated before they seem safe to use again. People providing care approach this isolation pragmatically. Someone must still bring food and water, must still tend to the sick person's needs, must still check on their condition and provide treatments. But casual contact is reduced. Others in the group keep their distance when possible, and children especially are kept away from proximity to the ill person because everyone has observed that children seem more susceptible to catching whatever adults carry. That illness seems to spread more readily to younger members when they have close contact with sick individuals. This practice of isolation, crude though it may be compared to modern quarantine protocols with their understanding of specific transmission mechanisms and incubation periods and required isolation durations, genuinely reduces disease transmission, breaking chains of infection that might otherwise sweep through an entire group, limiting the number of people who fall ill from each initial case, sometimes preventing widespread outbreak from what might have become epidemic if sick individuals had continued mixing freely with healthy ones. The effectiveness depends on how strictly the isolation is maintained and how quickly it begins after symptoms appear. Early isolation before the person has had much contact while symptomatic, proving more effective than delayed isolation after the sick person has already exposed many others. But even imperfect isolation provides some benefit. Sick people receive the best food available, bone marrow extracted from large animal bones by breaking them open and scraping out the rich fatty substance inside, providing dense calories in small volume, easy to consume even when appetite is poor. Organ meats like liver and heart and kidneys, rich in vitamins and minerals that support immune function and healing. Fish, when available for its easily digestible protein and oils that seem to help with inflammation and fever. Tender plant foods that require little chewing and digest easily when the gut is upset from illness. The group makes accommodations for this, ensuring the sick receive preferential access to prime foods even though they contribute nothing to food gathering while ill, temporarily becoming net consumers rather than producers, representing a form of health insurance where the group supports vulnerable members through crises with the implicit understanding that recovered individuals will later reciprocate when others face illness or injury, and that anyone might someday be the person needing support, making it in everyone's interest to maintain this system of mutual aid. Pregnant women receive similar preferential treatment, their increased nutritional needs recognized and accommodated through providing extra food and particularly nutritious items, ensuring they maintain strength and health through the demanding process of growing another human, reducing the risk of complications during pregnancy and childbirth that might endanger both mother and child, supporting adequate milk production after birth that will nourish the infant through its vulnerable first months of life. The food provided focuses on items believed to be particularly beneficial during pregnancy: certain organ meats, fish, specific plants, items selected based on tradition and observation of what seems to support healthy pregnancies and strong babies, not always with clear understanding of why particular foods help, but following practices that have proven successful over generations. The cumulative effect of these preventive practices, clean water selection, waste management, illness isolation, nutritional support for the vulnerable, probably reduces overall disease burden by something like 30 to 50% compared to what it would be without such measures, meaning that a substantial portion of survival without medicine stems not from treatment of illness once it occurs, but from prevention that reduces how often serious illness occurs in the first place. This represents perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of ancient healthcare, the recognition that avoiding disease proves easier and more effective than curing it, that environmental management and behavioral practices can maintain health more reliably than remedies can restore it once lost, that public health measures protect the entire group in ways that individual treatment cannot replicate. The practices don't eliminate illness. People still fall sick, still die from infections, still face health crises that preventive measures cannot avert. But they reduce the frequency and severity enough to make significant difference in overall health outcomes, allowing more people to remain healthy more of the time, reducing the burden of caring for sick members, maintaining group productivity and function at higher levels than would be possible without these practices. The investment in prevention, the effort required to maintain clean water sources, the discipline needed to manage waste properly, the accommodation required to isolate sick members and support them through illness, pays substantial returns in health benefits that accrue to the entire group. The immune systems of people who live in constant contact with diverse environmental microbes, who encounter bacteria and viruses and fungi and parasites from birth onward, who don't have the benefit of antibiotics or vaccines or sanitation that reduces pathogen exposure, develop in ways that modern hygienic environments no longer allow or promote, creating baseline immune competence that makes people more resistant to infections than current populations typically demonstrate, capable of fighting off pathogens that would sicken people raised in cleaner environments who haven't had the same degree of immune training. The exposure begins at birth, when the infant passes through the birth canal and acquires its first dose of maternal bacteria that colonize skin and gut. continues through infancy as children crawl on dirt floors that are cleaned periodically but never sterilized, put unwashed objects in their mouths as all babies do, exploring the world orally and acquiring microbes from everything they taste, play in streams and mud, interact with animals that live near or among people, encounter vast arrays of microorganisms that challenge and thereby train their developing immune systems through countless minor exposures. This isn't romanticization. The process kills some children through infections their immature immune systems cannot handle, the high infant mortality reflecting in part the cost of this immune training, with perhaps 30 to 40% of children dying before age 5 from infections that overwhelm developing defenses. But those who survive, who successfully navigate the gauntlet of childhood illnesses and emerge into adulthood, possess immune systems that have been tested and strengthened through countless minor challenges that have learned to respond effectively to bacterial and viral threats, that maintain memory of past encounters and mount faster responses to subsequent infections through the development of specific antibodies and immune cells trained to recognize particular pathogens, creating immunity that protects against future exposures to the same diseases. The survivors represent, in some sense, the fittest, those whose genetic makeup and individual development produced immune systems capable of handling the constant pathogen exposure that characterizes life in intimate contact with the natural world. Though fitness is relative and includes substantial elements of luck in which specific pathogens a child encounters, and in what order, and at what intensity, the children who survive early exposures to common pathogens emerge with immunity that protects them through adulthood, having already encountered and developed resistance to many of the infectious diseases that circulate within the population, meaning that adults face lower risk from many illnesses compared to children experiencing them for the first time. This pattern means that childhood represents the most dangerous period of life in terms of infectious disease mortality, with death rates dropping substantially once children reach age 5 or 6 and have survived the most vulnerable years. Their immune systems now trained and equipped with memory of multiple pathogens, capable of mounting rapid, effective responses to infections they've encountered before, and better able to handle novel infections through generally enhanced immune function. Physical fitness contributes to immune function in ways that modern sedentary populations rarely experience. The constant activity of hunting and gathering, building and traveling, carrying loads and climbing terrain, maintaining muscle mass and cardiovascular capacity that support overall health, including immune system effectiveness, ensuring that bodies function efficiently at distributing immune cells throughout tissues, at delivering oxygen and nutrients to all organs, including those of the immune system, at removing waste products that accumulate during infection and inflammation. Bodies adapted to regular, vigorous physical activity show better stress responses when illness strikes, more efficient metabolism that can redirect energy to fighting infection while maintaining adequate function of vital systems, stronger anti-inflammatory mechanisms that prevent the excessive immune response that can damage tissue as much as infection itself, all of which contribute to ability to fight off infections and recover from injuries more effectively than sedentary individuals whose bodies function less efficiently overall. The absence of obesity and metabolic syndrome, conditions virtually unknown in hunter-gatherer populations, where everyone maintains active lifestyle and food availability varies seasonally. Preventing chronic overconsumption means baseline inflammation levels stay low, bodies not dealing with the chronic immune activation that impairs response to acute infections. Immune resources available to respond to genuine threats, rather than being partially consumed by dealing with metabolic dysfunction and excess adipose tissue that produces inflammatory compounds. The lack of chronic diseases common in modern populations, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, fatty liver disease, conditions that impair immune function and complicate recovery from any illness, means that people enter any infectious challenge from a position of better baseline health, without the compounding factors that make infections more dangerous in populations with high rates of chronic illness. The varied diet, containing hundreds of different plant species consumed across seasons as availability changes, numerous types of meat from various animals, each with different nutrient profiles, fish and shellfish when accessible, insects and larvae that provide concentrated protein and fats, provides a range of nutrients including vitamins and minerals essential for immune function, maintaining the biochemical capacity needed to mount effective defenses against pathogens, supporting the constant production of immune cells and antibodies, and signaling molecules that coordinate immune responses. Specific nutrients particularly important for immune function: vitamin C from fresh plants, vitamin D from sun exposure and certain animal foods, zinc from meat and shellfish, vitamin A from organ meats, iron from blood and muscle tissue, are obtained through diverse diet in amounts adequate to support immune system needs, avoiding the deficiency states that impair immunity and increase susceptibility to infections. The trade-off for this enhanced immune competence involves higher childhood mortality, perhaps 30 to 40% of children dying before age 5, many from infections that their still developing immune systems cannot overcome, despite having the same basic genetic capacity for immune function that allows other children to survive similar exposures. But those who survive to adulthood possess immune systems that have been forged through genuine challenge, that function at high levels of effectiveness compared to populations living in cleaner but less immunologically stimulating environments, that can mount rapid, strong responses to infections and often overcome them before illness becomes severe. This represents a harsh reality where survival of the population depends partly on natural selection, on the fact that individuals with weaker immune function tend to die young, while those with stronger immune responses survive to reproduce and pass along whatever genetic and acquired advantages allowed them to overcome the constant pathogen exposure, gradually shaping populations toward greater immune competence over many generations, though always with variation that means some individuals remain more susceptible than others. The result is adult populations that rarely die from minor infections, whose bodies efficiently fight off the constant low-level pathogen exposures that come from living in close contact with soil and water and animals, who develop various minor illnesses through life but usually recover, whose major health threats come more from severe trauma, dangerous infections that overwhelm even robust immune systems, childbirth complications, and eventually the decline of old age, rather than from the everyday infectious challenges that populations with less developed immunity face more seriously. The system isn't perfect. People still die from infections. Epidemics still sweep through populations occasionally when novel pathogens appear. Some individuals remain more vulnerable throughout life, but baseline immune competence stays high enough that most adults most of the time maintain health without medical intervention, their bodies handling routine pathogen exposures automatically through immune responses that function effectively without need for pharmaceutical support. The hand burned from reaching too close to fire flames while tending meat being cooked, or from contact with hot stones used to boil water by dropping heated rocks into bark containers filled with liquid, or from grabbing a tool whose handle was positioned too near the fire and became hot without being obviously so, blistered and raw and radiating pain that makes the person cradle it carefully and resist any contact with the damaged skin, requires immediate treatment that begins with cold, submerging the hand in the coldest water available, ideally flowing stream water or water from a spring, where constant replenishment maintains cold temperature, keeping it there for as long as can be tolerated, despite the pain that intensifies initially when cold water first contacts burned tissue, but then gradually eases as the cooling takes effect. This cooling reduces the depth of thermal damage by stopping the burning process that continues even after contact with heat source ends. Heat energy still dissipating through layers of skin and continuing to damage tissue unless actively cooled, preserving tissue that might otherwise be destroyed by residual thermal energy still present in the burned area. The cooling continues for longer than seems necessary, the hand kept in cold water for perhaps the time it takes to tell a story or prepare a meal, ensuring that all the excess heat has been drawn out and no deeper burning continues. The water changed if it warms significantly from contact with the hot injured tissue, fresh cold water maintaining effective cooling. After the initial cooling comes honey, spread thickly over the entire burned area once the hand has been removed from the water, and patted gently dry with soft hide, covering every bit of damaged skin with a heavy layer that seals the burn from air exposure, which seems to intensify pain and provides both antimicrobial protection against the infection that burned tissue is particularly vulnerable to, and a moist environment that promotes healing without the burn wound drying and cracking, which would cause additional pain and impair healing. Some people use certain plant leaves instead of or in addition to honey. Aloe, if available in warmer regions where this succulent plant grows, its gel-like internal substance applied directly to burns where it soothes pain and promotes healing through mechanisms that modern science has partially explained, but ancient people simply observed worked well. Plantain leaves crushed and applied as poultice, providing cooling and soothing effects. Leaves from specific trees known through experience to help with burns, selected based on generational knowledge of what works rather than understanding of why it works. These treatments likely work through similar mechanisms of protection, moisture retention, and infection prevention, creating an environment where burned tissue can heal optimally, where new skin can grow from edges of the wound and from any surviving cells in deeper layers that weren't completely destroyed by heat. Minor burns, the kind that cause immediate pain and redness, and perhaps small blisters, but don't destroy skin completely through its full thickness, heal remarkably well with this treatment, usually without infection. If care is taken to keep the area clean and covered, the damaged skin gradually being replaced by new tissue growing from edges inward and from deep layers upward, though healing takes weeks and requires patience and continued care throughout the process. The pain eases after the first few days, the initial sharp agony giving way to dull ache and sensitivity. The person able to use the hand gently, though full use remains impossible until healing progresses further. The new skin appears pink and tender initially, more sensitive than normal skin, gradually toughening and taking on more normal appearance over months, though often remaining slightly different in texture or color compared to surrounding unburned skin, leaving evidence of injury that fades but never completely disappears. More severe burns that destroy skin completely through its full thickness, killing all cells in the affected area so that no living tissue remains to regenerate from, create wounds that heal slowly and with extensive scarring, the body having to fill in the damaged area entirely with scar tissue since no normal skin cells survive to regenerate, resulting in thick, rigid scars that lack the flexibility and sensation of normal skin, that contract as they heal and can limit movement if the burn crosses joints or covers large areas. These deeper burns take months to heal, requiring constant care throughout the lengthy process, frequent cleaning and reapplication of honey or other treatments, protection from contamination that would cause infection in tissue that has lost its normal barrier function, and defense mechanisms. The person remains partially disabled throughout healing, unable to use the burned part normally, requiring assistance with tasks they would normally perform independently, representing significant burden on the group that must support them through the long recovery. Burns covering large body surface area create life-threatening situations even when individual depth might be survivable, because the loss of skin barrier function allows fluid to leak from the body faster than it can be replaced through drinking, bacteria, to enter freely through the extensive damaged area without having to overcome normal skin defenses, and temperature regulation to fail, since skin normally helps maintain body temperature and burned skin cannot perform this function. A person with burns covering much of their chest and abdomen might survive the initial injury, might receive immediate cooling and honey treatment applied as carefully as possible, might be tended constantly by dedicated caregivers, but develops fever from infection within days. The burned tissue providing perfect environment for bacterial growth despite honey application, the extent of damage simply too large for available treatments to protect effectively. Death following often within a week from combination of infection that spreads into bloodstream causing sepsis, and fluid loss that leads to dehydration and circulatory collapse despite attempts to maintain hydration through drinking, the person declining visibly each day until they slip into unconsciousness and don't wake again. Deep burns to hands or feet, areas of constant use, impossible to keep perfectly clean and protected because these body parts contact surfaces constantly during normal movement and activity, show particularly high rates of infection despite careful treatment, and even those that heal without infection often leave the person with permanent loss of function, scar tissue that contracts during healing and pulls fingers or toes into bent positions that cannot be straightened, limiting ability to grasp objects or walk normally, chronic pain from nerve damage that causes constant burning or shooting sensations that never fully resolve. Burns to the face, risk damaging eyes through direct heat injury or through swelling that closes eyelids and traps infectious material against the eye surface, potentially causing blindness in one or both eyes. And burns that affect airways through inhaling hot air or smoke can cause swelling inside the throat that blocks breathing, leading to suffocation despite the burn itself being survivable, requiring constant vigilance and sometimes desperate measures to maintain airway patency. Burns around joints tend to heal with contractures that permanently limit mobility even when the person survives and infection is avoided. The scar tissue that forms during healing, lacking the elasticity of normal skin and pulling tight as it matures, gradually drawing the joint into bent position that resists straightening, sometimes requiring physical intervention of repeatedly stretching the scar tissue to prevent the worst contractures. Though this causes pain and sometimes damages healing tissue, a burn across the inside of the elbow that heals with contracture might leave the arm permanently bent, unable to straighten fully, limiting reach and strength. A burn crossing the ankle might leave the foot pulled into abnormal position, causing limping gait and difficulty with walking long distances or over rough terrain. The honest assessment acknowledges that while treatment for burns involves genuine medical knowledge that improves outcomes substantially compared to no treatment, that minor to moderate burns heal successfully most of the time with appropriate care, allowing return to normal function. Severe burns carry high mortality rates and significant permanent disability among survivors, representing injuries where ancient medicine could support healing but not overcome the fundamental damage that extensive thermal injury inflicts on the body. The difference between survivable and fatal burns often comes down to extent more than depth. Small, deep burns healing better than large, shallow ones. The total surface area affected determining whether the body can compensate for the loss of skin function while healing occurs, or whether the injury overwhelms the body's capacity to maintain homeostasis without intact skin covering. Stomach troubles that bring cramping, nausea, diarrhea, the miserable feeling of intestines that won't settle, various digestive complaints that make eating uncomfortable or impossible get treated with specific plant remedies chosen based on the particular symptoms the person experiences. Knowledge accumulated over generations about which plants help which types of digestive distress, refined through countless applications to countless cases of stomach upset across many individuals and many years. Mint leaves chewed fresh or steeped in warm water settle nausea and ease stomach cramping through compounds that relax smooth muscle in the digestive tract, providing relief within perhaps 20 to 30 minutes of consumption, and allowing people suffering from upset stomach to keep down food and water they might otherwise vomit back up, preventing the dehydration and malnutrition that can follow when stomach upset persists for days and nothing stays down. The mint grows in damp areas near water, its distinctive smell making identification easy even before flowers appear, and most people know where good mint patches grow, returning to these sources whenever someone develops stomach troubles that might benefit from mint treatment. The leaves are best used fresh but can be dried for winter use, though they lose some potency during storage, requiring larger amounts of dried mint to achieve the same effect as fresh leaves would provide. The tea is prepared by pouring hot water over crushed leaves and letting them steep until the water takes on green color and strong minty smell and taste. Then consumed slowly, sipping rather than gulping, allowing the compounds to begin working before adding more liquid to an already upset stomach. Bitter herbs, various plants that share intensely bitter taste but otherwise differ in appearance and habitat, stimulate digestive secretions and seem to help when the problem involves sluggish digestion or feeling of fullness and discomfort after eating. The bitterness triggering physiological responses that improve digestion through mechanisms people observe without understanding the underlying biochemistry, simply knowing that bitter herbs taken before or after meals help with certain types of digestive complaints. The specific bitter herbs available vary by region and season, but experienced healers know several plants that provide this bitter quality and use them interchangeably or in combinations, adjusting which ones to use based on what's available at the moment someone needs treatment. Chamomile for general digestive upset, especially when accompanied by stress or anxiety that seems to worsen the stomach problems, providing gentle relief without the intensity of some other remedies, useful particularly for ongoing mild complaints rather than acute severe symptoms. Certain types of bark steeped in water provide compounds that reduce diarrhea by slowing intestinal movement and helping the body reabsorb water from intestinal contents, though these must be used carefully because stopping diarrhea completely when the body is trying to expel something harmful can make things worse, requiring judgment about when diarrhea represents helpful clearance of problematic material versus when it has become excessive and is causing dehydration that poses its own dangers. Charcoal from fire, ground into fine powder, and mixed with water into a gritty drink that tastes of nothing much besides charcoal texture, helps with certain types of poisoning or digestive upset. The charcoal absorbing toxins from the digestive tract and carrying them out of the body in feces, though the mechanism remains mysterious to people who simply know that this treatment sometimes helps when someone has eaten something that makes them sick, that it seems particularly useful for cases where bad food or questionable plant material has been consumed and stomach distress follows. Clay from specific deposits, fine textured and clean tasting, mixed with water and drunk, seems to coat the stomach and intestines, providing relief from irritation and perhaps also absorbing toxins or harmful bacteria. Another remedy arrived at through trial and observation rather than theoretical understanding. Used when other treatments don't seem appropriate or when the particular type of stomach upset seems to match what clay helps with based on past experience. The effectiveness of these digestive remedies varies considerably. Minor stomach upset responds well. Cramping eases within an hour or two of treatment. Nausea subsides enough to allow eating small amounts. Normal appetite returns within hours to days as the problem resolves, often without anyone knowing exactly what caused the upset in the first place or whether it would have resolved without treatment. But severe gastrointestinal infections that cause violent vomiting and diarrhea simultaneously, the kind that quickly lead to dangerous dehydration through fluid loss from both ends, often progress despite all treatments, particularly in young children and older adults whose reserves are limited and who cannot tolerate extended periods without retaining food and water, whose smaller or less robust bodies decompensate more quickly when fluids are lost faster than they can be replaced. Deaths from severe diarrheal illness probably occur fairly regularly, perhaps every few months within a group of 30 or 40 people. Someone falling ill with intestinal infection that causes such violent fluid loss that they become fatally dehydrated within days, skin losing elasticity and tenting when pinched, eyes sinking into sockets as facial tissues lose hydration, consciousness fading as the body loses the fluid volume needed to maintain blood pressure and organ function, lips cracking and tongue becoming dry and swollen. The treatments available: plant remedies to reduce cramping and nausea, honey mixed in water to provide both fluids and energy in form that might stay down better than plain water, cooling if fever develops as the body fights infection, constant attention and attempts to get small sips of liquid into the person every few minutes, help some people survive who might otherwise die, probably improving survival rates by perhaps 20 to 30%. But cannot prevent all deaths from severe infections that modern medicine would treat with intravenous fluids to replace what's lost, and antibiotics to kill the causative bacteria. But that ancient medicine can address only through supportive care and hope that the person's body fights off the infection before dehydration becomes irreversible. The pattern of who survives severe diarrheal illness versus who dies reflects partly the severity of infection and partly individual factors. Young, healthy adults often survive, their bodies able to tolerate significant fluid loss and fight off infection while gradually recovering. Small children frequently die, their smaller bodies having less reserve and becoming dehydrated more quickly from the same relative fluid loss. Elders sometimes survive if the infection is not too severe, but often succumb to serious cases, their aging bodies less resilient and less able to compensate for the stress. The specific pathogen matters too, though people cannot distinguish different types of diarrheal illness beyond observing that some cases seem more severe than others, that sometimes many people get sick at once, suggesting contagious illness, while other times only one person is affected, suggesting individual food poisoning rather than communicable disease. Pain from injuries, from illness, from chronic conditions that develop from old wounds that healed imperfectly, or from the wear and tear that accumulates through decades of physical labor, from the inevitable aches that come with aging bodies, exists as constant companion that must be managed through whatever means available, because total pain elimination rarely proves possible, and learning to function despite discomfort becomes necessary skill for living effectively in a world where pain of various types strikes frequently and treatments remain limited in their effectiveness. Willow bark provides the most reliable pain reduction for many types of pain. The throbbing ache of injuries and inflammation, the sharp edge of headaches that make thinking difficult and work impossible, the deep pain of inflamed joints that worsens with movement and makes even simple activities challenging. working gradually over the course of an hour or so to dull pain to more manageable levels without eliminating it entirely, bringing relief that allows function without necessarily bringing comfort, reducing suffering enough to make life livable though not pleasant. Other plants offer pain relief for specific conditions. Clove for toothaches. The essential oils in clove numbing tooth and gum tissue remarkably effectively when a piece of clove is held against the painful area, providing relief that allows eating and sleeping despite dental problems that might otherwise make these basic activities impossible, though the relief is temporary and requires repeated application as the numbing effect wears off over hours. Poppy plants in some regions provide latex that, when dried and consumed in small amounts, brings both pain relief and euphoria through compounds that modern medicine isolates as opiates. Powerful analgesics that work through entirely different mechanisms than willow bark's anti-inflammatory effects, providing the strongest pain relief available from natural sources, but carrying significant risks that make their use reserved for only the most severe and otherwise unmanageable pain. The knowledge of poppy use requires careful teaching, because doses that relieve pain approach doses that stop breathing, the margin between effective and fatal being narrow enough that inexperienced users might accidentally overdose and die from respiratory depression, the breathing slowing and shallowing until it stops entirely, and the person dies peacefully in drug-induced sleep, never waking again. This means poppy preparations are used only by those with extensive experience, only for pain that cannot be managed otherwise, only under careful observation to ensure breathing continues adequately. The powerful pain relief balanced against genuine danger in ways that make poppy medicine both valuable and frightening, treated with respect that reflects its power to both save and kill. Beyond plant remedies, pain management involves distraction through activity when possible, keeping busy with tasks that occupy attention and prevent dwelling on discomfort. The observation that pain seems more intense when nothing else occupies the mind, leading to practices that keep injured or ill people engaged in light activities when their condition allows, sitting near others who are working and contributing what they can, even if only through conversation and companionship, rather than physical labor, maintaining social connection that provides psychological support and mental distraction from physical discomfort. Community provides distraction through conversation, storytelling, the presence of others who can redirect attention away from pain through social interaction, who can share stories of their own past injuries and recoveries and pain management, normalizing suffering, and providing hope through examples of others who endured and eventually healed. Rest, when activity would worsen injury, but occupation of mind through mental engagement when rest allows, finding the balance between protecting damaged tissue and maintaining psychological well-being despite ongoing discomfort, recognizing that both physical and mental states affect healing, and that maintaining spirits helps maintain will to recover. Pain that persists despite treatment doesn't mean failure, doesn't mean more treatment should be frantically sought, but rather represents the limits of what can be achieved with available remedies, requiring acceptance and adaptation rather than desperate searches for solutions that don't exist. The reality includes acceptance that some pain cannot be eliminated, that certain injuries and conditions bring chronic discomfort that becomes part of life, that the absence of pain proves impossible to achieve, and managing pain to tolerable levels represents success rather than failure. An elder with arthritis in multiple joints, the cartilage worn away from decades of use, leaving bone grinding against bone with every movement, lives with constant ache that worsens in cold weather when joints stiffen, eases slightly in warmth when movement becomes somewhat easier, can be dulled somewhat with willow bark, but never fully relieved, requiring the person to adjust activities to accommodate the pain. The elder moves more slowly than in youth, takes longer to rise from sitting, avoids activities that cause sharp pain spikes while maintaining enough movement to prevent complete stiffening, accepts help with tasks that once came easily like gathering firewood or processing hides, adapts to declining physical capability while maintaining dignity and value through knowledge and experience that younger, stronger bodies cannot provide. Someone with an old injury that healed with some deformity, experiences persistent pain with certain movements, has learned over months or years which activities trigger worse pain and adjusts accordingly, avoids full extension of a joint that was once broken and now protests such movement, finds positions for sleeping that minimize discomfort through careful arrangement of sleeping furs and body position, develops strategies for living with the permanent consequence of past trauma that will never fully heal. This acceptance of pain as part of existence, this development of coping strategies rather than expecting total relief, represents necessary adaptation to medical limitations while also reflecting generally lower baseline pain levels in populations without obesity that stresses joints, without metabolic disease that causes widespread inflammation, without sedentary lifestyle that leads to chronic back and neck pain from poor musculature support, meaning that even those with chronic pain from old injuries often experience less overall discomfort than modern populations whose lifestyle creates pain even without specific injuries. Childbirth brings women together in ways that few other events do. Multiple experienced mothers attending when labor begins, gathering at first sign that birth is approaching, bringing knowledge passed down through generations about what to expect at each stage, what helps ease labor, what signals danger requiring intervention, how to support the laboring woman through the intense physical process of bringing new life into the world, their presence providing both practical assistance and emotional support through an experience that remains fundamentally dangerous despite being natural and common. The laboring woman walks when she can, movement seeming to help labor progress by using gravity to encourage the baby's descent, and by keeping the pelvis mobile allows contractions to work more effectively. The experienced attendants encouraging her to remain upright and moving as long as strength allows, then helping her into squatting or kneeling positions when bearing down becomes necessary, positions that use gravity to assist the baby's descent through the birth canal, and that feel instinctively more effective than lying flat, which seems to work against natural forces rather than with them. The attendants offer encouragement with each contraction, reminding the woman that pain means progress, that each wave brings the baby closer to birth, that she possesses the strength to complete this task that women have accomplished since humans first existed. They provide physical support, holding her when she needs to be held, applying pressure to her lower back where pain concentrates during labor, offering water and small amounts of food to maintain energy through what may be many hours of intense physical effort. They offer herbal preparations that traditional knowledge suggests may ease labor or strengthen contractions. Tea made from certain barks or roots, honey mixed with water for quick energy, compresses of warm water against the lower back or abdomen, treatments that may or may not have pharmacological effects, but that provide comfort through the attention and care they represent even if their biochemical impact remains uncertain. Hands check progress periodically, experienced fingers feeling for the baby's head to ensure presentation is normal, with head rather than buttocks or feet coming first, assessing whether labor advances at reasonable pace or whether something seems wrong that might require intervention, monitoring for excessive bleeding or other signs of complications that would change the situation from normal labor to dangerous emergency. The attendants watch for signs that the baby is in distress, that labor is stalling dangerously, that the mother's strength is failing, ready to intervene however they can, though their options remain limited, without surgical capability or medical equipment beyond their hands and experience and knowledge. Most births proceed without major complications, labor lasting anywhere from hours to sometimes more than a day for first births, shorter usually for women who have birthed before. The woman laboring through waves of contractions that intensify and come closer together, exhausting herself, but ultimately pushing the baby out into waiting hands positioned to catch and support the emerging infant, preventing it from falling and being injured by landing on hard ground. The infant crying immediately and vigorously signals successful birth, the sound bringing relief and joy to everyone present, indicating that the baby breathes and functions as it should. The cord pulsing still with blood from placenta that remains briefly attached before being severed with a sharp stone blade or knife, cut several finger widths from the baby's belly, and then tied off to prevent bleeding from the severed vessels, the placenta itself birthing shortly after the baby, once final contractions, expel it from the uterus. The placenta gets examined carefully to ensure it appears complete with no fragments that might remain inside which could cause later bleeding or infection. The attendants checking that the whole organ has been delivered, that nothing seems torn or missing, that the uterus is contracting firmly to close off blood vessels and prevent hemorrhage. The new mother receives immediate attention, checked for tears that might need treatment, cleaned and made comfortable, given water and food if she desires them, helped to begin nursing the baby within hours of birth to stimulate milk production and provide the infant with colostrum rich in immune factors. The baby receives gentle cleaning, the white coating left mostly in place since it seems to protect the skin, placed skin to skin with mother, where warmth and familiar heartbeat sounds provide comfort and security. The two beginning the bonding process that will sustain them through the demanding months ahead. The new mother receives special care in the days and weeks following birth, kept warm by the fire, given the best foods available to support milk production and recovery from the intense physical demands of labor, helped with the constant demands of newborn care by other women who take turns holding and soothing the infant when mother needs rest, cleaning soiled materials, and bringing fresh moss or soft hides for the baby, preparing food and bringing it to the mother so she need not leave her resting area. The woman is excused from normal work responsibilities, allowed to focus primarily on nursing and recovering while others take over her usual tasks, providing the support that allows her body to heal from childbirth and establish milk supply without the additional stress of maintaining normal activity levels. The whole group celebrates successful birth with extra attention to mother and child, protecting the vulnerable pair through their most delicate days, recognizing that the future of the group depends on babies surviving to adulthood, and therefore that supporting new mothers serves everyone's interests. The survival rate for healthy women giving birth in normal circumstances probably reaches 70 to 80%, meaning that most births end with living mother and living child, both surviving the immediate dangers of labor and delivery to begin the next phase where continued survival depends on avoiding infection, establishing successful nursing, and the baby thriving through the vulnerable first weeks of life. This represents success that reflects both the female body's remarkable design for childbirth, evolved over millions of years to accomplish this function, though not without risk, and the accumulated knowledge of experienced birth attendants who understand how to support the process effectively, when to intervene, and when to allow labor to progress naturally, how to recognize and sometimes address complications that arise. Young women giving birth for the first time face somewhat higher risk than women who have previously delivered successfully, their bodies not yet proven capable of the enormous physical demand that childbirth requires. pelvic bones not yet having spread and adapted through previous birth, tissues not yet having stretched and learned how to accommodate a baby's passage, inexperience making the process more frightening and potentially more difficult than it will be with subsequent births if this first one succeeds. But even among first-time mothers, the majority survive and deliver healthy infants when labor proceeds normally and no complications arise that attendants cannot manage. The female body, generally capable of accomplishing the task it evolved to perform even on the first attempt, though success is never guaranteed and every birth carries genuine risk. However, the remaining 20 to 30% of births involve complications that ancient birth attendants can recognize but not always resolve, situations where knowledge and experience and care prove insufficient to overcome physical problems that require interventions unavailable without modern medical technology. Babies positioned wrong, emerging feet or bottom first instead of head first, making passage through the birth canal far more difficult and dangerous for both mother and child, because the largest part, the head, comes last rather than first, and can become stuck after the body has already emerged, cutting off oxygen supply while trapped. The attendants try to turn babies if malposition is detected before labor becomes too advanced, pressing firmly on the mother's belly to encourage the baby to rotate into correct position, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing, their external manipulations unable to reliably reposition a baby that has settled into breech or transverse position. Babies too large for the mother's pelvis, a particular problem for women with naturally narrow pelvises or babies who have grown unusually large, labor stalling after hours of unproductive contractions that fail to push the baby past the pelvic opening no matter how hard the mother pushes or how many positions are tried. Exhaustion setting in as hours stretch into a day or longer, the mother's strength draining away as she continues to labor without progress, contractions eventually weakening as the uterine muscle tires, the baby stuck and unable to descend further no matter what is attempted, attendants unable to extract the baby without surgical access that doesn't exist and wouldn't be survivable anyway. These obstructed labors sometimes end with both mother and baby dying after prolonged suffering, sometimes with the baby dying and the mother surviving after delivering a child already dead from oxygen deprivation, sometimes with both surviving after labor finally progresses through sheer endurance, though often with injuries to mother or baby from the prolonged difficult birth. Bleeding that begins during labor and doesn't stop, or worse, the catastrophic hemorrhage that sometimes follows placenta delivery when the uterus fails to contract properly and blood pours from the birth canal faster than the body can replace it, draining away the mother's blood volume within minutes or hours. Attendants pressing on the abdomen to try to stimulate uterine contraction, packing the birth canal with materials to slow bleeding, giving the woman fluids to drink, though nothing can replace the blood volume being lost, the woman becoming pale and weak, consciousness fading as blood pressure drops from insufficient volume, death coming within hours despite all efforts to stop the bleeding, the newborn left without a mother on the day of birth, requiring other women to nurse the infant if they have milk available, or facing the sad reality that an infant who cannot be fed will not survive long. Placenta that detaches too early during labor, cutting off the baby's oxygen supply before birth completes, resulting in infant born already dead or so weakened by oxygen deprivation that it cannot cry or breathe effectively and dies within minutes, despite attempts to stimulate breathing. Placenta positioned across the cervix rather than higher in the uterus, blocking the baby's exit route entirely, making vaginal delivery impossible and thus fatal without surgical intervention to extract the baby through the abdominal wall, procedure that doesn't exist in this era and wouldn't be survivable if attempted. Cord wrapped around the baby's neck, tightening with each contraction as the baby descends, cutting off blood flow and oxygen, sometimes loosely enough that it can be slipped over the baby's head when it emerges. Other times so tight that the baby emerges blue and limp, sometimes revivable with stimulation and vigorous rubbing and clearing of airways, but often already gone. The attendants try everything they know, attempting to turn malpositioned babies, applying pressure to stop bleeding, using plant preparations believed to help, massaging the uterus to encourage contraction, clearing infant airways and stimulating breathing. But when these interventions fail, when labor simply cannot progress, or bleeding cannot be controlled, or the baby cannot survive the delivery, both mother and baby may die despite all efforts, or the baby is born dead after prolonged obstructed labor, and the mother survives traumatized and weak and grieving, or the mother dies shortly after birth from hemorrhage that drains her life away within minutes, while attendants watch helplessly, unable to stop the flow, no matter how much pressure they apply or what remedies they attempt. These birth deaths, perhaps accounting for 15 to 20% of mortality among women of reproductive age, represent one of the starkest reminders that natural medicine has clear limits, that some emergencies require interventions that simply don't exist without modern surgical capability and blood transfusion, that survival sometimes depends more on luck than on knowledge or skill or effort. Infant mortality adds another harsh dimension to the already sobering realities of reproduction and early childhood, with perhaps 30 to 40% of babies dying before reaching their first year, some during the vulnerable first days after birth, when the transition from womb to world proves too challenging for infants who are slightly premature or slightly smaller or slightly less vigorous, unable to nurse effectively, and thus unable to gain proper nutrition, unable to maintain body temperature adequately, and thus becoming dangerously cold despite being kept near fire and wrapped in furs, unable to fight off the infections that constantly threaten newborns whose immune systems have not yet developed beyond the passive immunity received from mother through placenta and breast milk. The deaths cluster in the first few weeks especially, bodies so small and new and fragile that any challenge can overwhelm them, breathing stopping suddenly without warning as systems that seem to be working simply fail, or infections entering through the healing umbilical stump and spreading through the tiny body faster than immune defenses can respond. Mothers losing babies know this represents common tragedy rather than rare occurrence. Most women who survive to middle age having lost at least one child in infancy, if not more, the grief worn into their faces but normalized through shared experience that provides some comfort through the knowledge that others have endured similar loss, the entire group understanding that not all babies survive despite best care and deepest wishes, that some infants simply lack the strength or constitution needed to thrive outside the womb, that death in early life represents harsh but expected reality rather than surprising tragedy, though this normalization doesn't diminish the pain each mother feels when her infant dies. The babies who survive the first weeks still face ongoing risks through their first year. Digestive troubles that leave them unable to absorb nutrition properly, respiratory infections that fill tiny lungs with fluid and make breathing labored, fever that climbs too high for small bodies to tolerate, injuries from falls or accidents as they begin moving and exploring, dehydration from diarrhea that depletes their small fluid reserves dangerously fast. Mothers nurse frequently, providing not just nutrition but also immune protection through antibodies and other factors in breast milk that help compensate for the infant's immature immune system, keeping babies close during cold weather to maintain warmth, protecting them from obvious dangers while allowing the exploration necessary for development and learning, walking the line between protection and the exposure to minor challenges that helps build immune competence. The group assists with infant care, experienced mothers offering advice to new ones, other women helping with holding and soothing particularly fussy babies to give mothers brief respites from constant demands. Older children carefully supervised while interacting with infants to prevent accidental injuries while allowing social bonds to develop. The collective investment in infant survival reflects recognition that children represent the group's future, that high infant mortality makes each surviving child valuable, that supporting mothers through the exhausting work of keeping babies alive serves everyone's interest, even though infants contribute nothing productive and consume substantial resources through the attention and food they require. Teeth remain remarkably healthy in people whose diet contains no processed sugars, no refined grains, nothing soft enough to pack between teeth and ferment there, creating acids that dissolve enamel and allow decay to penetrate into deeper structures where it causes pain and infection. The diet of tough meats requiring extensive chewing, fibrous plants that scrub teeth as they're consumed through their texture and through the vigorous chewing they demand, crunchy nuts and seeds that exercise jaw muscles and clean tooth surfaces, hard roots that must be gnawed and ground between teeth to break down into consumable pieces, keeps teeth relatively clean through mechanical action that removes food particles and stimulates healthy gum tissue through the pressure and movement of chewing. The constant chewing, hours each day spent processing foods that require substantial oral work before swallowing, stimulates blood flow to jaw and gums, maintains bone density in the jaw that supports teeth, exercises muscles that keep the whole oral system functioning well into old age for most people. Tooth decay occurs, but at rates far lower than in agricultural or modern populations whose diets include sticky carbohydrates and sugars that bacteria feast upon, producing acids as metabolic byproduct that attack enamel and create cavities. Cavities developing slowly when they occur at all, usually in older adults whose teeth have experienced decades of use and whose enamel has gradually thinned, and even then the decay often progresses slowly enough that the tooth remains functional for years before becoming problematic. The person learning to chew on the other side or to avoid particularly hard foods that stress the weakened tooth. The overall oral health proves surprisingly good, most people retaining strong functional teeth through their entire lives, able to chew tough foods into old age, teeth yellowed perhaps from years of use and stained from various foods, but structurally sound and firmly rooted in healthy jawbone. Toothaches, when they do develop from decay or from infection at the root of a tooth or from cracks that expose sensitive inner layers, bring intense pain that radiates through the jaw and into the skull. Pain that makes eating difficult or impossible since chewing stresses the damaged tooth and sends jolts of agony through the head. That disturbs sleep because lying down increases blood pressure in the head, which intensifies throbbing in the affected tooth, that concentrates attention and makes thinking about anything else challenging, demanding treatment that unfortunately proves limited in what it can achieve. Clove provides the most effective relief, the essential oils in this dried flower bud acting as both painkiller and antiseptic when applied directly to the affected tooth. A piece of clove held between cheek and the painful tooth, where saliva gradually extracts the oils and carries them to the damaged area, temporarily numbing the area and providing hours of relative comfort before the pain returns and requires reapplication, the process repeating as many times as necessary to manage pain through days or weeks until the problem resolves or the tooth is lost. Willow bark helps dull the pain somewhat when taken internally. The systemic pain relief it provides, reducing the overall intensity of discomfort, even if it cannot eliminate the localized agony of inflamed tooth and surrounding tissue, making toothache more bearable if not comfortable, allowing some sleep and some eating, though neither returns fully to normal until the tooth problem resolves. Some infected teeth abscess, forming pockets of pus at the root where bacteria have established infection that the body attempts to wall off, the abscess growing until it finds path of least resistance and drains through the gum. And occasionally this drainage resolves the infection enough that pain subsides dramatically, and the tooth, though damaged and weakened, remains in place and continues functioning for months or years, the infection having been expelled and the remaining tooth structure adequate for continued use. Other abscessed teeth result in spreading infection that causes facial swelling, the cheek or jaw puffing up with fluid and pus as infection spreads into surrounding tissues, sometimes draining externally through the skin, leaving a hole that leaks fluid for days before healing, fever developing as the body fights the infection systemically, and occasionally death when infection tracks into the bloodstream causing sepsis or spreads to the brain causing meningitis. Though such fatal dental infections probably remain relatively rare given the overall good dental health of the population and the tendency for most dental abscesses to drain and resolve before spreading lethally. The person who develops serious dental infection becomes seriously ill, unable to eat because of pain and swelling, feverish and weak, requiring the same supportive care as any serious infection with cooling treatments and willow bark tea and nutritional support through broths and soft foods that can be consumed without much chewing, usually surviving after days or weeks of illness, but occasionally dying despite all care. Tooth loss from trauma, a blow to the face during hunting accident or conflict, a fall that drives the face into rock or hard ground, knocking teeth loose or breaking them off at the root, occurs more commonly than tooth loss from decay, and the gap left behind gradually fills in as remaining teeth shift slightly over months and years, the jaw adapting to the changed configuration through subtle remodeling of bone, the person learning to chew differently to accommodate the missing tooth or teeth, directing food to the other side, or adjusting chewing technique to work with remaining dentition. Complete tooth loss occurs rarely except in very old age, most people retaining functional dentition through their entire lives, even if not every tooth survives, chewing capability maintained well enough to process the tough foods that form their diet, the strong jaws and healthy gums that result from constant use, providing foundation for dental health that agricultural populations with their softer, higher carbohydrate diets will lose, beginning the dental decay and loss patterns that characterize grain-eating peoples. Sleep becomes the body's primary healing mechanism, the time when damaged tissue repairs itself most actively through processes that occur continuously but accelerate during sleep. When immune system function peaks with increased production and activity of immune cells that fight infection and clear damaged tissue, when energy normally directed toward activity and awareness can be fully devoted to maintenance and restoration of physical systems that wear down during waking hours. Sick or injured people sleep more than usual, sometimes spending most of each day asleep or in drowsy, half-waking state, where consciousness drifts in and out. The body essentially commandeering control away from conscious will and forcing rest that facilitates healing. And this extended sleep aids recovery in ways that no treatment can replicate, providing the time and metabolic conditions needed for complex repair processes to proceed optimally. The group accommodates this need without question or complaint, understanding that healing requires rest more than it requires anything else, ensuring that people who require extra sleep can do so undisturbed, keeping noise levels lower near where they sleep so that sounds won't wake them unnecessarily. maintaining fire through the night so cold won't disturb their rest or force them to wake and tend to fire themselves, checking on them periodically but otherwise leaving them to the deep restorative sleep that illness or injury demands. The sick or injured person arranged comfortably on soft furs with support for injured parts positioned to minimize pain, covered warmly to maintain comfortable temperature without overheating, placed near enough to fire for warmth, but not so close that heat becomes uncomfortable or smoke irritating. The sleeping area prepared with attention to details that support undisturbed rest through the hours and days of intensive healing. The sleeping environment supports this healing rest through its quiet darkness, the shelter blocking most external light once fire burns low or is banked for night, the thick walls muffling sounds from outside so that animal noises or wind or rain don't penetrate to disturb sleepers, the proximity of others providing security that allows full relaxation without needing to maintain vigilance against threats. The entire space designed through generations of experience to facilitate the deep sleep that people require for survival and health. The sleeping furs, clean and soft and warm, carefully prepared through lengthy process of scraping and tanning that removes oils and makes hides supple, provide comfort that eases physical discomfort enough to allow sleep despite pain or illness. The careful arrangement of multiple layers creating cushioning and insulation, temperature regulation through adding or removing layers as needed, attention to the reality that sick people often feel temperature extremes more intensely than healthy ones and require adjustment of covering through the night as fever climbs or breaks. Smoke from the fire, drifting through the shelter before escaping through vents near the ceiling, carries compounds from burning wood that may have mild antimicrobial properties, various volatile substances released as wood combusts that settle on surfaces and may inhibit bacterial growth, though people wouldn't understand this in those terms. Simply knowing through experience that well-ventilated shelters with good fires seem to have less illness than cold, smoky spaces where ventilation is poor and smoke accumulates irritatingly, or completely smoke-free environments that lack whatever protective benefit fire smoke provides. The specific wood burned matters, some types producing smoke that smells pleasant and seems to promote rest, while other woods create acrid smoke that irritates eyes and lungs, knowledge of which woods to burn developing through experience and being passed down as practical wisdom about fire management. The healing power of sleep combines with good nutrition and supportive care to create recovery rates that, while not matching modern medical success percentages, still allow many people to survive illnesses and injuries that seem severe, the body possessing remarkable regenerative capacity when given adequate rest, good food, protection from additional stress or injury, and time to activate its own healing mechanisms without interference from factors that would impair immune function or tissue repair. Modern understanding of sleep's role in immune function, in hormone regulation that supports tissue regeneration, in clearing of cellular waste products that accumulate during waking activity, in neurological health and psychological well-being, confirms what ancient people knew through observation, that sick people need sleep more than almost anything else, that rest itself represents powerful medicine equal to or exceeding any plant remedy, that ensuring someone can sleep deeply and long contributes critically to their chances of recovery from whatever threatens them. The elders, those who have survived to ages beyond 40 or 50 years, rare enough that they represent perhaps 1 in 10 or 20 members of a typical group, carry accumulated medical knowledge that represents hundreds of years of collective human experience compressed into the memories and understanding of individuals who have lived long enough to witness countless illnesses and injuries and treatments across decades of observation. An elder who has lived 60 years exceptional longevity that marks someone whose constitution and luck allowed survival through all the threats that claimed their peers, has witnessed hundreds of injuries and illnesses personally, has seen which treatments work, in which situations through direct observation of outcomes, has observed the patterns that predict whether someone will recover or decline, has learned to recognize subtle signs that indicate what's wrong and what might help, diagnostic and prognostic abilities developed through experience rather than through formal training or systematic study, but nonetheless valuable and often accurate. This elder knows that certain types of coughs respond to one plant preparation, while different coughs require different remedies. Having observed over decades that dry hacking cough improves with one treatment, while wet productive cough needs another approach, that cough accompanied by fever suggests different underlying problems than cough without systemic symptoms, distinguishing between conditions that require aggressive intervention versus those likely to resolve on their own with simple supportive care. The elder recognizes that belly pain in the upper right area suggests different problems than pain in the lower left, having seen enough cases of various abdominal complaints to notice patterns in location and type of pain and associated symptoms, developing mental catalog of what different pain patterns might mean and what treatments might help or at least won't harm. The elder knows that fever with rash means something distinct from fever without rash, that certain rash patterns indicate specific illnesses, that some of these illnesses prove mild while others carry high mortality, allowing better prediction of outcomes and more appropriate matching of treatment intensity to disease severity. These diagnostic distinctions arrive through pattern recognition rather than understanding of underlying disease processes. No knowledge of which bacteria or viruses cause which symptoms, no ability to test for specific pathogens or measure objective markers of disease severity, only the accumulated observations of what different presentations tend to mean based on past cases and their outcomes. But pattern recognition works, allowing experienced practitioners to make reasonable guesses about what's wrong and what might help, to avoid applying treatments that would worsen the situation, to provide realistic expectations to sick people and their families about whether recovery seems likely or whether death appears more probable, to allocate limited medical resources appropriately, rather than expending precious rare plant medicines on cases likely to fail while withholding them from cases where they might make crucial difference. The loss of such an elder represents catastrophic loss of information that cannot be easily replaced. Remedies that worked but are now forgotten because only this elder knew about them or knew the precise preparation method that made them effective. Plants that helped but can no longer be identified with certainty because the elder who could recognize them reliably is gone. Treatment sequences that improved outcomes but weren't transmitted clearly enough before death occurred for others to replicate them accurately. Younger people try earnestly to learn from elders while they live, spending time with them watching treatments being administered, asking questions about why this plant instead of that one for this particular complaint, when to apply honey versus when to use pine resin, how long to continue willow bark before trying something else if pain doesn't adequately respond. Accumulating knowledge that may take decades to fully internalize and understand through their own experience of applying what they learned and observing outcomes across many cases. But elders die, sometimes suddenly from accident or acute illness that kills quickly before knowledge can be transmitted, sometimes gradually from the accumulated wear of aging that slowly reduces function and eventually ends life. And each death carries away knowledge that cannot be fully recovered, leaving gaps in medical understanding that may never be filled, remedies lost perhaps forever, unless rediscovered through new trials, diagnostic skills that die with the person who developed them through lifetime of careful attention to subtle clues. The community tries to preserve knowledge by ensuring multiple people learn healing arts, by encouraging anyone with interest to apprentice with knowledgeable elders, by creating some redundancy so that the loss of one person doesn't erase entire categories of medical knowledge, but perfect preservation proves impossible, and every generation likely loses some information, even as it gains new discoveries through its own experiences. The diagnostic process, as practiced by experienced healers, relies heavily on listening carefully to symptoms described by the patient or by those caring for them, hearing not just what is said, but what might be implied by the specific words chosen and by what isn't mentioned, observing visible signs like rashes or swelling or changes in skin color that might indicate internal problems, noticing pallor that suggests blood loss or anemia, flushed color that indicates fever, yellowish tinge that points to liver or bile duct problems, touching to assess heat that indicates inflammation or infection, feeling for tenderness that localizes pain to specific areas, detecting masses beneath the skin that might represent abscesses or other abnormalities, sensing differences in tissue consistency that experienced hands can interpret as meaningful, smelling breath that carries distinctive odors associated with particular conditions, wounds that smell foul indicating infection versus those that smell relatively clean, body fluids that carry characteristic scents in various disease states, urine that smells sweet possibly indicating certain metabolic problems, though without understanding the biochemistry of diabetes that this sign might suggest. Some healing traditions include tasting urine to detect sweetness that indicates certain diseases, the glucose spilling into urine when blood sugar exceeds what kidneys can reabsorb, giving urine sweet taste that experienced practitioners recognize as significant, though without effective treatment for diabetes. The value of this diagnosis remains limited beyond perhaps explaining why the person experiences constant thirst and hunger and why wounds heal poorly. These diagnostic methods, while primitive by modern standards with their sophisticated imaging and laboratory tests, allow experienced practitioners to differentiate between conditions that require different treatments with reasonable accuracy, to estimate prognosis with better than random precision, to know when intervention might help versus when the person likely faces inevitable death. Regardless of treatment attempted, practical skills that develop through decades of careful observation and that contribute significantly to medical outcomes, even without sophisticated understanding of disease mechanisms. The diagnostic skill represents as much medical knowledge as the treatments themselves, perhaps more, because selecting wrong treatment for a given condition may prove worse than no treatment at all, potentially causing harm through misapplication of remedies to conditions they don't benefit, and knowing which situations call for aggressive intervention versus which require only supportive care can determine whether limited resources are used effectively or wasted on futile efforts. The healer who recognizes that certain severe infections will likely prove fatal regardless of treatment can focus limited plant medicines on more promising cases, can help family accept inevitable death, and shift from aggressive treatment to comfort care, can prevent false hope that makes grief harder, while also avoiding expenditure of resources that might save other lives if applied differently. Food serves not just as fuel, but as medicine in its own right. Specific foods given to specific conditions based on accumulated knowledge about what helps healing in various situations, selections made through generations of observation about what sick people tolerate well, what seems to speed recovery, what provides strength when strength is needed most. Bone marrow, extracted by breaking long bones from large animals and scooping out the rich fatty substance inside using fingers or carved implements, provides dense calories and nutrients particularly valuable for people recovering from injuries or fighting infections. The high fat content easily digested even when appetite remains poor, and heavy foods sit uneasily in upset stomach. The nutrients supporting immune function and tissue repair through mechanisms unknown but observed to be effective. The marrow can be eaten raw, the rich fatty substance consumed directly from the broken bone, or cooked by placing marrow bones directly in fire until the marrow melts and can be poured into a container, or consumed by sucking it from the bone ends, or added to broths where it enriches the liquid with fat and flavor and nutrients. Sick people receive marrow even when healthy people might not. The limited supply from each animal kill allocated preferentially to those whose bodies fight to survive illness or heal from injury. Recognition that concentrated nutrition matters more when the body diverts enormous resources to healing processes. Organ meats, especially liver and heart and kidneys from various animals, contain concentrated vitamins and minerals that support healing. Traditional knowledge, recognizing that these foods strengthen sick people even without understanding which specific nutrients they provide or how those nutrients function biochemically. Simply observing over generations that people who eat organ meats during illness seem to recover better and faster than those who consume only muscle meat. That certain organs seem particularly beneficial for certain conditions, though the exact relationships remain mysterious. Liver, given to people who seem weak and pale, perhaps responding to the high iron content that addresses anemia, though without understanding the connection between iron and blood health, simply knowing that liver helps pallor and weakness. Heart fed to people recovering from exhausting illnesses, possibly benefiting from the high concentration of certain vitamins in cardiac muscle tissue, or simply from the symbolism of consuming heart to strengthen one's own heart. The distinction between biochemical effect and placebo effect impossible to separate, but the practical benefit observed regardless of mechanism. Kidneys provided to people with certain urinary symptoms or belly complaints, possibly through association between the kidney's function in the animal and perceived benefit to similar systems in the sick person, or possibly through genuine nutritional benefits that kidneys provide. The knowledge transmitted without full understanding of why it works, but with confidence that it does work based on generations of observation. Fish, when available through living near waters that provide them or through trade with groups that have access, offers easily digestible protein along with oils that seem to reduce inflammation and support brain function, making it preferred food for people recovering from head injuries or experiencing confusion from illness. For people with joint pain or other inflammatory conditions, selected based on observed benefits, even without understanding the anti-inflammatory properties of omega-3 fatty acids that modern science has identified in fish oils. Certain plant foods get given to specific conditions. Berries for digestive troubles, their fiber and certain compounds helping to normalize bowel function, whether someone suffers from diarrhea or constipation. Roots for sustained energy during recovery from exhausting illness, their starchy carbohydrates providing steady fuel. Leafy greens for people who seem weak and pale, possibly responding to various vitamins and minerals. These plants contain, though the connection would be observed rather than understood. Broths made by long simmering bones and meat scraps in water, extracting nutrients and gelatin and minerals from the solid materials into liquid form, provide hydration along with nutrition, easy to consume for people who cannot chew solid food due to mouth injuries or digestive upset or extreme weakness. Warm and comforting to stomachs that reject heavier fare, representing one of the most reliable ways to maintain some nutrition in people too ill to eat normally, keeping them from becoming severely malnourished during illness, which would further compromise their ability to heal. The entire group adjusts food distribution to ensure sick members receive optimal nutrition within the constraints of what's available, recognizing that recovery depends partly on maintaining strength through illness, that people who eat well during sickness fare better than those who become malnourished, that investing prime food resources in healing members benefits the whole group through faster return to productivity, through reduced risk of death that would represent permanent loss of a member's contributions and knowledge. The investment makes sense pragmatically even beyond any compassionate motivations. Sick people who receive adequate nutrition recover faster and more completely, return to full function rather than being left weakened and marginally productive, justify the temporary diversion of resources to their care through their eventual return to contributing roles. Pregnant and nursing mothers receive similar preferential food access, their increased nutritional needs recognized and met through group effort, ensuring they maintain health through the demanding physical processes of growing and feeding new humans, reducing risks of complications during pregnancy and childbirth that might endanger both mother and child, supporting adequate milk production after birth that will nourish the infant through its vulnerable first months of life when survival depends entirely on mother's milk and thus on mother's ability to produce it in sufficient quantity and quality. The food provided focuses on items believed to be particularly beneficial during pregnancy. Certain organ meats rich in nutrients needed for fetal development, fish when available for brain development, specific plants selected based on tradition and observation of what seems to support healthy pregnancies and strong babies, items selected not through nutritional science but through generational wisdom about what works, even if why it works remains mysterious. Children during growth spurts get extra food when available, their bodies' requirements for building tissue exceeding normal intake needs, their increased appetite signaling that additional resources should be directed their way, recognition that investing in growing children benefits the group's future by ensuring the next generation reaches full size and strength rather than being stunted by inadequate nutrition during critical growth periods. Injured people healing broken bones receive foods believed to strengthen bone, perhaps items associated with hardness or strength through symbolic reasoning, or foods that experience suggests actually do speed bone healing through mechanisms that might or might not have basis in nutritional biochemistry. The selections representing sincere attempts to support healing through dietary intervention, even when understanding of how and why remains incomplete. The balance of survival without medicine encompasses this entire complex system of care and knowledge and practices and limitations, not reducible to simple declarations of success or failure, but rather representing nuanced reality where many approaches work partially, where outcomes depend on multiple factors interacting in ways that resist simple prediction, where luck and timing and individual variation play significant roles alongside knowledge and skill and effort. Someone who suffers a deep cut may survive if yarrow and honey are applied immediately, if the wound remains clean through healing despite ongoing use of the affected body part. If no major blood vessels were severed, that might cause life-threatening blood loss. If the person's immune system functions well enough to fight off bacteria that inevitably enter any wound, if infection doesn't develop despite best efforts at prevention or develops but remains localized rather than spreading systemically. The same injury in someone already weakened by recent illness whose immune resources are depleted, or occurring during cold weather that slows healing through reducing blood flow to extremities, or in a location difficult to keep clean and protected like hands or feet that constantly contact contaminated surfaces might prove fatal despite identical treatment. The difference between survival and death, determined by circumstances partly beyond anyone's control, by factors that can be influenced but not eliminated. The survival strategies people employ include strong preventive practices that reduce how often serious illness occurs through clean water selection and waste management, and isolation of contagious sick, natural immunity developed through constant pathogen exposure in those who survive the dangerous childhood years when immune systems are still developing, accumulated plant knowledge spanning hundreds of species that genuinely helps many conditions through compounds with real pharmacological effects, careful wound management that prevents many infections through thorough cleaning and application of natural antiseptics, supportive community care that provides optimal conditions for healing through rest and nutrition and protection, recognition that rest and nutrition represent fundamental medicine as important as any plant remedy. These strategies allow groups to maintain health and function across generations, to survive endemic diseases and occasional epidemics that sweep through, causing temporary increase in mortality but not eliminating the population, to raise children who grow into healthy adults despite high infant and childhood mortality rates, to support members through injuries and illnesses until they recover and resume productive roles, creating system robust enough that populations grow over time rather than declining, that knowledge continues to accumulate rather than being lost, that life continues with sufficient child survival and reasonable adult longevity to maintain group viability. Yet alongside these successes exist the failures that modern medicine makes easy to forget were once inevitable parts of life. Children dying from fevers that antibiotics would cure in days, crying for water and burning with heat that won't break despite all cooling efforts and all plant remedies, slipping away after days of suffering that leaves parents grieving and helpless. Women dying in childbirth from complications that cesarean section would resolve immediately, hemorrhaging that no amount of pressure can stop, or babies positioned impossibly that cannot be extracted without surgery, deaths that come in moments of what should be joy, leaving newborns motherless and families shattered. Adults dying from infected wounds that proper antisepsis and antibiotics would heal readily, watching redness spread up a limb from a wound that seemed minor initially, fever climbing despite treatments, death following within a week from what began as a simple cut, people suffering chronic pain from conditions that modern surgery could correct, living with limitations and discomfort that reduces quality of life substantially, accepting reduced function as inevitable when it needn't be. Disabilities from healed fractures that proper casting and alignment would have prevented, people limping or unable to use arms fully because bones healed crookedly, permanent limitations from temporary injuries, blindness from infections that simple medication would stop, deafness from ear infections that brief treatment would clear, losses of function that steal capabilities and independence, paralysis from spinal injuries that careful stabilization might have preserved some function from, people becoming completely dependent when they might have retained some mobility, countless small and large tragedies that accumulate into significant mortality and morbidity across populations and across lifetimes, representing the sobering cost of living without modern medical interventions. The honest assessment acknowledges both the impressive capabilities of natural medicine, real and sophisticated and often effective within its domain, and the genuine limitations that meant survival remained uncertain for any serious illness or injury. That luck played perhaps equal role to knowledge in determining outcomes, that people lived with clear-eyed understanding that death might come at any time from things beyond their control or ability to treat effectively. They developed sophisticated natural remedies that modern science confirms contain active compounds with genuine therapeutic effects, measurable in laboratories, proving that these weren't merely placebos or wishful thinking, but real medicines with real mechanisms. They observed and learned and refined treatments over millennia of accumulated experience, passing knowledge carefully across generations because they understood its value. They supported each other through sickness and injury with compassion and skill and dedication, providing the best care their knowledge allowed. They prevented many illnesses through careful behavior and environmental management that reduced pathogen exposure and transmission. And yet they also died young by modern standards. Average life expectancy, perhaps 35 years though, with wide variation. Buried children with heartbreaking regularity, perhaps half of children born not surviving to adulthood. Watched people suffer and decline from conditions modern medicine treats easily and takes for granted as survivable. Faced medical emergencies with only their knowledge and their care and hope that the body's own healing power would prove sufficient, sometimes being rewarded with recovery and sometimes watching helplessly as death came despite all efforts. This represents the complex reality of survival without modern medicine. Neither romanticized natural paradise where plant remedies cured everything and people lived in perfect harmony with nature, nor helpless suffering where people died from minor ailments and had no effective responses to illness or injury, but rather sophisticated adaptation to genuine limitations, real knowledge working within significant constraints, resilience and community and luck combining to allow human life to continue and even flourish despite the ever-present shadow of illness and injury that could strike anyone at any time without warning and without certainty of cure. The fire burns low, settling into coals that glow red in darkness, warmth radiating outward, but diminishing slowly as night advances, and someone rises quietly to add wood without being asked, maintaining the heat that keeps shelter comfortable through night hours, keeps bodies warm while they sleep and heal and rest, the action so habitual that it requires no thought, part of the constant attention to survival that characterizes every day and every night. The smoke rises, finds the vents carefully positioned to allow escape without creating drafts that would make the shelter cold, carries out into cold night air where it disperses into darkness. And inside the breathing continues steady and regular, the sleepers safe in their communal space, the sick tended and monitored, the knowledge preserved in those who remember and who will teach others, ready to be applied again when morning brings new challenges and new needs and new opportunities to use what generations have learned about keeping people alive in a world that offers no hospitals, no pharmaceuticals, no advanced medical technology, only plants and knowledge and careful observation, and the body's own remarkable capacity to heal itself when given support and time and protection from the countless things that threaten life in every season and every day and every generation.